The Dummy That Lived by L. Frank Baum. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Samantha Miles. In all fairyland there is no more mischievous a person than Tanko-Mankie, the Yellow Ryl. He flew through the city one afternoon, quite invisible to mortal eyes, but seeing everything himself, and noticed a figure of a wax lady standing behind the big plate glass window of Mr. Floman's department store. The wax lady was beautifully dressed, and extended in her stiff left hand was a card bearing the words, "Rare bargain! This stylish costume, imported from Paris. Former price $20. Reduced to only $19.98. This impressive announcement had drawn before the window a crowd of women shoppers, who stood looking at the wax lady with critical eyes. Tanko-Mankie laughed to himself the low, gurgling little laugh that always means mischief. Then he flew close to the wax figure and breathed twice upon its forehead. From that instant the dummy began to live, but so dazed and astonished was she at the unexpected sensation that she continued to stand stupidly staring at the women outside and holding out the placard as before. Anyone but Tanko-Mankie would have remained to help the wax lady out of the troubles that were sure to overtake her, but this naughty elf thought it rare fun to turn the inexperienced lady loose in a cold and heartless world and leave her to shift for herself. Fortunately, it was almost 6 o'clock when the dummy first realized that she was alive, and before she had collected her new thoughts and decided what to do, a man came around and drew down all the window shades, shutting off the view from the curious shoppers. Then the clerks and cashiers and floor-walkers and cash-girls went home, and the store was closed for the night, although the sweepers and scrubbers remained to clean the floors for the following day. The window inhabited by the wax lady was boxed in, like a little room, one small door being left at the side for the window trimmer to creep in and out of. So the scrubbers never noticed that the dummy, when left to herself, dropped the placard to the floor and sat down upon a pile of silks to wonder who she was, where she was, and how she happened to be alive. For you must consider, dear reader, that in spite of her size and her rich costume, in spite of her pink cheeks and fluffy yellow hair, this lady was very young, no older, in reality, than a baby born but half an hour. All she knew of the world was contained in the glimpse she had secured of the busy street facing her window. All she knew of people lay in the actions of the group of women which had stood before her on the other side of the window-pane, and criticized the fit of her dress, or remarked upon its stylish appearance. So she had little enough to think about, and her thoughts moved somewhat slowly. Yet one thing she really decided upon, and that was not to remain in the window and be insolently stared at by a lot of women who were not nearly so handsome or well-dressed as herself. By the time she reached this important conclusion, it was after midnight, but dim lights were burning in the big deserted store, so she crept through the door of her window and walked down the long aisles, pausing now and then to look with much curiosity at the wealth of finery confronting her on every side. When she came to the glass cases filled with trimmed hats, she remembered having seen upon the heads of the women in the street similar creations. So she selected one that suited her fancy, and placed it carefully upon her yellow locks. I won't attempt to explain what instinct it was that made her glance into a nearby mirror to see if the hat was straight, but this she certainly did. It didn't correspond with her dress very well, but the poor thing was too young to have much taste in matching colors. When she reached the glove counter, she remembered that gloves were also worn by the women she had seen. She took a pair from the case and tried to fit them upon her stiff, wax-coated fingers, but the gloves were too small and ripped in the seams. Then she tried another pair, and several others as well, but hours passed before she finally succeeded in getting her hands covered with a pair of pea-green kids. Next, she selected a parasol from a large and varied assortment in the rear of the store. Not that she had any idea what it was used for, but other ladies carried such things, so she also would have one. When she again examined herself critically in the mirror, she decided her outfit was now complete, and to her inexperienced eyes there was no perceptible difference between her and the women who had stood outside the window. Whereupon she tried to leave the store, but found every door fast locked. The wax lady was in no hurry. She inherited patience from her previous existence. Just to be alive and to wear beautiful clothes was sufficient enjoyment for her at present. So she sat down upon a stool and waited quietly until daylight. When the janitor unlocked the door in the morning, the wax lady swept past him and walked with stiff but stately strides down the street. The poor fellow was so completely whuckered at seeing the well-known wax lady leave her window and march away from the store that he fell over in a heap, and only saved himself from fainting by striking his funny bone against the doorstep. When he recovered his wits, she had turned the corner and disappeared. The wax lady's immature mind had reasoned that, since she had come to life, her evident duty was to mix with the world and do whatever other folks did. She could not realize how different she was from people of flesh and blood, nor did she know she was the first dummy that had ever lived, or that she owed her unique experience to Tanko-Mankie's love of mischief. So ignorance gave her a confidence in herself that she was not justly entitled to. It was yet early in the day, and the few people she met were hurrying along the streets. Many of them turned into restaurants and eating-houses, and following their example, the wax lady also entered one, and sat upon a stool before a lunch-counter. "Coffee and rolls," said a shop-girl on the next stool. "Coffee and rolls," repeated the dummy, and soon the waiter placed them before her. Of course she had no appetite, as her constitution, being mostly wood, did not require food, but she watched the shop-girl, and saw her put the coffee to her mouth and drink it. Therefore the wax lady did the same, and the next instant was surprised to feel the hot liquid trickling out between her wooden ribs. The coffee also blistered her wax lips, and so disagreeable was the experience that she arose and left the restaurant, paying no attention to the demands of the waiter for 20 cents, mum. Not that she intended to defraud him, but the poor creature had no idea what he meant by 20 cents, mum. As she came out, she met the window trimmer at Bloemen's store. The man was rather near-sighted, but seeing something familiar in the lady's features, he politely raised his hat. The wax lady also raised her hat, thinking it the proper thing to do, and the man hurried away with a horrified face. Then a woman touched her arm and said, "Beg pardon, ma'am, but there's a price mark hanging on your dress behind." "Yes, I know," replied the wax lady stiffly. "It was originally $20, but it's been reduced to $19.98. The woman looked surprised at such indifference and walked on. Some carriages were standing at the edge of the sidewalk, and seeing the dummy hesitate, a driver approached her and touched his cap. "Cab, ma'am?" he asked. "No," said she, misunderstanding him. "I'm wax." "Oh!" he exclaimed, and looked after her wonderingly. "Here's your morning paper," yelled a newsboy. "Mine, did you say?" she asked. "Sure. Chronicle, Choir, Republican 'Spatch. What'll you have?" "What are they for?" inquired the wax lady simply. "Why, to read, o' course. All the news, you know." She shook her head and glanced at a paper. "Looks all speckled and mixed up," she said. "I'm afraid I can't read." "Ever been to school?" asked the boy, becoming interested. "No. What's school?" she inquired. The boy gave her an indignant look. "Say," he cried, "you're just a dummy, that's what ye are," and ran away to seek a more promising customer. "I wonder what he means," thought the poor lady. "Am I really different in some way from all the others? I look like them, certainly, and I try to act like them, yet that boy called me a dummy, and seemed to think I acted queerly." The idea worried her a little, but she walked on to the corner, where she noticed a streetcar stop to let some people on. The wax lady, still determined to do as others did, also boarded the car and sat down quietly in a corner. After riding a few blocks, the conductor approached her and said, "Fare, please." "What's that?" she inquired innocently. "Your fare," said the man impatiently. She stared at him stupidly, trying to think what he meant. "Come, come," growled the conductor, "either pay up or get off." Still she did not understand, and he grabbed her rudely by the arm and lifted her to her feet. But when his hand came in contact with the hard wood of which her arm was made, the fellow was filled with surprise. He stooped down and peered into her face, and, seeing it was wax instead of flesh, he gave a yell of fear and jumped from the car, running as if he had seen a ghost. At this the other passengers also yelled and sprang from the car, fearing a collision, and the motorman, knowing something was wrong, followed suit. The wax lady, seeing the others run, jumped from the car last of all, and stepped in front of another car coming at full speed from the opposite direction. She heard cries of fear and of warning on all sides, but before she understood her danger, she was knocked down and dragged for half a block. When the car was brought to a stop, a policeman reached down and pulled her from under the wheels. Her dress was badly torn and soiled. Her left ear was entirely gone, and the left side of her head was caved in, but she quickly scrambled to her feet and asked for her hat. This a gentleman had already picked up, and when the policeman handed it to her and noticed the great hole in her head and the hollow place it disclosed, the poor fellow trembled so frightfully that his knees actually knocked together. "Why, ma'am, you're killed!" he gasped. "What does it mean to be killed?" asked the wax lady. The policeman shuddered and wiped the perspiration from his forehead. "You're it!" he answered with a groan. The crowd that had collected were looking upon the lady wonderingly, and a middle-aged gentleman now exclaimed, "Why, she's wax!" "Wax!" echoed the policeman. "Certainly. She's one of those dummies they put in the windows," declared the middle-aged man. The people who had collected shouted, "You're right! That's what she is! She's a dummy." "Are you?" inquired the policeman sternly. The wax lady did not reply. She began to fear she was getting into trouble, and the staring crowd seemed to embarrass her. Suddenly a bootblack attempted to solve the problem by saying, "You guys is all wrong. Can a dummy talk? Can a dummy walk? Can a dummy live?" "Hush!" murmured the policeman. "Look here!" And he pointed to the hole in the lady's head. The newsboy looked, turned pale, and whistled to keep himself from shivering. A second policeman now arrived, and after a brief conference it was decided to take the strange creature to headquarters. So they called a hurry-up wagon, and the damaged wax lady was helped inside and driven to the police station. There the policeman locked her in a cell and hastened to tell Inspector Mugg their wonderful story. Inspector Mugg had just eaten a poor breakfast and was not in a pleasant mood, so he roared and stormed at the unlucky policemen, saying they were themselves dummies to bring such a fairy tale to a man of sense. He also hinted that they had been guilty of intemperance. The policeman tried to explain, but Inspector Mugg would not listen, and while they were still disputing, in rushed Mr. Floman, the owner of the department store. "I want a dozen detectives at once, Inspector!" he cried. "What for?" demanded Mugg. "One of the wax ladies has escaped from my store and eloped with a 1998 costume, a 423 hat, a 219 parasol, and a 76-cent pair of gloves, and I want her arrested." While he paused for breath, the inspector glared at him in amazement. "Is everybody going crazy at the same time?" he inquired sarcastically. "How could a wax dummy run away?" "I don't know, but she did. When my janitor opened the door this morning, he saw her run out." "Why didn't he stop her?" asked Mugg. "He was too frightened, but she's stolen my property, Your Honor, and I want her arrested," declared the storekeeper. The inspector thought for a moment. "You wouldn't be able to prosecute her," he said, "for there's no law against dummy stealing." Mr. Floman sighed bitterly. "Am I to lose that 1998 costume and the 425 hat and—" "By no means," interrupted Inspector Mugg. "The police of this city are ever prompt to act in defense of our worthy citizens. We have already arrested the wax lady, and she is locked up in cell number 16. You may go there and recover your property if you wish, but before you prosecute her for stealing, you'd better hunt up a law that applies to dummies." All I want, said Mr. Floman, is that 1998 costume and— Come along, interrupted the policeman. I'll take you to the cell. But when they entered number 16, they found only a lifeless dummy lying prone upon the floor. Its wax was cracked and blistered, its head was badly damaged, and the bargain costume was dusty, soiled, and much bedraggled. For the mischief-loving Tanko-Mankie had flown by, and breathed once more upon the poor wax lady, and in that instant her brief life ended. "It's just as I thought," said Inspector Mugg, leaning back in his chair contentedly. "I knew all the time the thing was a fake. It seems sometimes as though the whole world would go crazy if there wasn't some level-headed man around to bring 'em to their senses. Dummies are wooden wax, and that's all there is of 'em." "That may be the rule," whispered the policeman to himself. "But this one were a dummy as lived." End of The Dummy That Lived by L. Frank Baum. Recording by Samantha Miles.
The Poor Little Doll by Miss W. K. Clifford. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Etel Bus. It was a plain little doll that had been bought for 6 pence at a stall in the marketplace. It had scanty hair and a weak composition face, a calico body and a foolish feet that always turned inwards instead of outwards, and from which the sawdust now and then oozed. Yet in its glass eyes there was an expression of amusement. They seemed to be looking not at you, but through you. And the pursed-up red lips were always smiling at what the glass eyes saw. "Well, you were a doll," the boy said, looking up from his French exercise. "And what are you staring at me for? Is there anything behind?" he asked, looking over his shoulder. The doll made no answer. "And whatever are you smiling for?" he asked. "I believe you were always smiling. I believe we'd go on if I didn't do my exercise till next year, or if the cat died, or the monument tumbled down." But still the doll smiled in silence, and the boy went on with his exercise. Presently he looked up again and yawned. "I think I'll go for a stroll," he said, and put his book by. "I know what I will do," he said suddenly. "I will take that doll and hang it up to the apple tree to scare away the sparrow." And calling out, "Sis, I have taken your doll. I'm going to make a scarecrow of it," he went off to the garden. His sister rushed after him, crying out, "Oh, my poor doll! Oh, my dear little doll! What are you doing to it, you naughty boy?" "It's so ugly," he said. "No, it's not ugly," she cried. "And it's so stupid. It never does anything but smile. It can't ever grow. It never gets any bigger." "Poor darling doll," she said, as she got it once more safely into her arms. "Of course it can't grow. But it's not your fault. They did not make any tucks in you to let it out. And it's so unfeeling." It went smiling away like anything when I could not do my French. "It has no heart. Of course it cannot feel. Why hasn't it got a heart?" "Because it isn't alive. You ought to be sorry for it, and very, very kind to it, poor thing." "Well, what is it always smiling for?" "Because it's so good," answered Sis, bursting in tears. "It is never bad-tempered. It never complains, and it never did anything unkind." And kissing it tenderly, "You are always good and sweet," she said, "and always look smiling, though you must be very unhappy at not being alive." End of The Poor Little Doll by Miss W. K. Clifford.
How the Rhinoceros Got His Skin by Rudyard Kipling. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Once upon a time, on an uninhabited island on the shores of the Red Sea, there lived a Parsee from whose hat the rays of the sun were reflected in more than oriental splendor. And the Parsee lived by the sea with nothing but his hat and his knife and a cooking stove of the kind that you must particularly never touch. And one day he took flour and water and currants and plums and sugar and things, and made himself one cake, which was 2 feet across and 3 feet thick. It was indeed a superior comestible, that's magic, and he put it on the stove because he was allowed to cook on the stove, and he baked it till it was all done brown and smelt most sentimental. But just as he was going to eat it, there came down from the beach, from the altogether uninhabited interior, one rhinoceros with a horn on his nose, 2 piggy eyes, and few manners. In those days, the rhinoceros's skin fitted him quite tight. There were no wrinkles in it anywhere. He looked exactly like a Noah's Ark rhinoceros, but of course much bigger. All the same, he had no manners then, and he has no manners now, and he never will have any manners. He said, "How?" And the Parsee left that cake and climbed to the top of a palm tree, with nothing on but his hat, from which the rays of the sun were always reflected in more than oriental splendor. And the rhinoceros upset the oil stove with his nose, and the cake rolled on the sand, and he spiked that cake on the horn of his nose, and he ate it, and went away, waving his tail through the desolate and exclusively uninhabited interior, which abuts on the island of Mazanderan, Socotra, and promontories of the larger equinox. Then the Parsee came down from his palm tree to put the stove on its legs, and recited the following sloka, which, as you have not heard, I will now proceed to relate. Them that takes the cakes, which the Parsee man bakes, makes dreadful mistakes. And there was a great deal more in that than you would think, because 5 weeks later there was a heat wave in the Red Sea, and everybody took off all the clothes they had. The Parsee took off his hat, but the rhinoceros took off his skin and carried it over his shoulder as he came down to the beach to bathe. In those days it buttoned underneath with 3 buttons, and looked like a waterproof. He said nothing whatever about the Parsee's cake, because he had eaten it all, and he never had any manners then, since, or henceforth. He waddled straight into the water and blew bubbles through his nose, leaving his skin on the beach. Presently the Parsee came by and found the skin, and he smiled one smile that ran all round his face 2 times. Then he danced 3 times round the skin and rubbed his hands. Then he went to his camp and filled his hat with cake crumbs, for the Parsee never ate anything but cake, and never swept out his camp. He took that skin, and he shook the skin, and he scrubbed that skin, and he rubbed that skin just as full of old, dried, stale, tickly cake crumbs and some burned currants as ever it could possibly hold. Then he climbed to the top of his palm tree and waited for the rhinoceros to come out of the water and put it on. And the rhinoceros did. He buttoned it up with the 3 buttons, and it tickled like cake crumbs in bed. Then he wanted to scratch, but that made it worse, and he lay down on the sand and rolled, and every time he rolled the cake crumbs tickled him worse and worse. Then he ran to a palm tree and rubbed himself against it. He rubbed so much and so hard that he rubbed his skin into a great fold over his shoulders, and another fold underneath where the buttons used to be, but he rubbed the buttons off. So he rubbed some more folds over his legs, and it spoiled his temper, but it didn't make the least difference to the cake crumbs. They were inside his skin, and they tickled. So he went home very angry indeed, and horribly scratchy, and from that day to this every rhinoceros has great folds in his skin and a very bad temper, all on account of the cake crumbs inside. But the Parsee came down from his palm tree wearing his hat, from which the rays of the sun were reflected in more than oriental splendor, packed up his cooking stove, and went away in the direction of Orotavo, amygdala, the upland meadows of Anatarvio, and the marshes of Sonopet. This uninhabited island is off Cape Gardafui, by the beaches of Socotra and the pink Arabian Sea. It's too hot from Suez, for the likes of you and me, ever to go in a P&O and call on the cake Parsi. End of How the Rhinoceros Got His Skin by Rudyard Kipling. Read by Frances Brown.
The Strange Little Girl, a story for children by V.M. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. 1. Once upon a time, there was a beautiful palace where the king's children lived as happily as they alone can live. They never wanted anything, and they never knew that there could be others who were not as happy as they. Sometimes, it is true, they would hear a story which would make them almost think that perhaps there was a world beyond, which they did not know, outside the palace of the king and its gardens. But something would seem to say that after all it was only a fairy story, and they would forget that it meant anything that might really be true. One of the little princesses seemed to think more of these stories of a world beyond the palace garden than the others, and she would sometimes find herself gazing at the sun, and wondering if the great world lay beyond the purple forests where the golden-edged clouds shone like dark mountains in the distance. And the name of this princess was Aileen. More and more as she thought of these things, she felt sure that there must be a world where things were very different from the happy life in the palace garden. And in the stories which the children heard, she thought of many things, which with the others she used to pass by without notice. Once they used to hear of no sorrow, no pain, but only joy and peace. Now, in thinking, she sometimes noticed that there were things which were not spoken, that there were things passed by in silence, that there were things which travelers passing through the palace kept back, as though they knew of much which the children must not know, and yet which they would have told had they dared. Questions Aileen asked, and the answers seldom satisfied her, for they never seemed to tell her everything. Every time one of the travelers left the palace to return on his journey, there seemed to be a look of appeal in his eyes, an appeal which only Aileen seemed to see, and which made her wish to follow them for the very love that shone in the kind faces of these strangers. Strangers who told the children stories of things they loved, of wonderful fairy worlds where they were not as in the palace, of worlds where Aileen seemed to have traveled many times, long, long ago. One day she asked her father, the king, "Shall I never go out of the palace, never leave the garden of delight and see the world that lies beyond the cloud mountains, beyond the sunset and the whispering forests?" And the king looked intently at Aileen. "These are strange fancies," he said. "Are you not happy here in the garden?" "Yes, I am happy," she said, "happier than I can tell. But you have not answered me. Is there not a world beyond? Shall I ever see it?" "Some traveler must have been telling you forbidden tales," said the king. "These things I have said may not be spoken in my garden." "No traveler has told me," said Aileen. "I have seen them looking as though they would tell me, but could not, of things beyond the garden, beyond the palace. I have asked them, and they told me nothing. Yet I have felt that I long to go with them. I have felt that I remember strange places, strange sights, things I know not here when they speak. Sometimes even it seems that I hear a voice like my own repeating a promise unfulfilled that must be kept. I will return, I will, it says. And I hear voices calling in the wind, in the rustling of the leaves, and in the silence of the day. Come back, come back. And the birds say, come, The pines whisper to me strange things, and the laughing water in the brooks says, 'Come.' What does it mean?" "I cannot tell you here," said the king. "But why do you wish to leave the palace? You are yet young, and there are many, many years of happiness before you. You may stay in the palace where all things are good, and put these things out of your mind. There is another world, but not for you yet." Eline was troubled, or would have been, had such a thing been possible in the palace of the king. "May I ever see that land? May I ever leave the palace?" "The children of the king are free to come and go," he said. "I may not keep them if they will not stay, for I know that they will come again." 2. Again a traveller came to the palace. He brought with him a harp of 7 strings, on which he played to the children. He sang to them for a while, and then for a space was silent. Eline listened to the strange, beautiful music, and to her it seemed that there was speech in the harp, that it spoke. The other children seemed to listen to the music, but to them it did not seem to speak. To Eline there were echoes of wonderful things the palace knew not, things that the language of the king could not tell. The harp spoke in a way that the Princess Eline knew and understood, although there were no words in its tones. There were sad and sorrowful notes that told of sorrows the palace never knew. There were strains of music that sounded harsh to the listening ear, though to the careless they told of happiness alone. And as she listened, Eline dreamed. Clearer and more clear she felt that the harp told of a world of men where sorrow and sadness and strife were not unknown, where joy should be and was not, where the people groped their way through darkness and thought it light. "Return, return," called the harp. And a mighty resolve came to Eline. "I will return, I will, I will." She remembered the king saying, "The children of the king are free to come and go," he had said. "I may not keep them if they will not stay," he had told her. She loved him much, but the call came clear, and she dared not seek him to say farewell, lest she should be persuaded to remain. She bowed her head, and to the harper spoke. "I will go," she said. "I will return with you." Then the harp sent forth such a melody of joyous music that it echoed thrilling through the hot, discordant notes of the world beyond the sunset, and for a moment a chord of harmony ran through the life of men. "Joy unto you, men of the underworld! Joy unto you, children of sorrow! Joy unto you, sons of forgetfulness! Joy unto all beings!" They passed out of the garden together, the musician and the soul. 3. Westward they travelled, westward, ever westward. The way was dark and sometimes dreary, and Eline felt like one awakened from a beautiful dream before it was ended. Through the pine forests, over mountains, in deep valleys, and by mighty streams they travelled, for they had the harp to cheer the way, to urge their footsteps onward, for the path was untrodden where they went. "There is a path," the harper said, "a pleasant path and broad, but the journey is long, and we must hasten on our way. To the setting sun, to the gleaming sea we must go, nor may we seek a beaten track lest we be too late." A river there was in whose waters were reflected pictures of all that surrounded them, such crystal clear reflections that sometimes it seemed as if they looked at real things in the water mirrored in the things around them. And on the waters grew beautiful lotus flowers, lilies with cup-shaped leaves. In the blue and white petals of the lotus also there seemed to be reflections, so clear were they. The musician plucked one of the cup-like lily pads and filled it with the water for Eline. The still surface of the water shone like silver in its green cup as Eline held it. Then the musician played. Soft and low and sweet were the notes of that wonderful harp. Scarcely they rippled the surface of the water, and yet they vibrated, trembled, spread, until picture after picture came to the surface of the water in colors of every hue. Scarcely may it be told what Eline saw in the magic cup in the water of remembrance. She seemed to see herself, and yet another, in picture after picture. Now she saw herself as part of a golden sea of selves which made but one self, so lifelike were they, so glorious was their unity. Then in life after life Eline seemed to see her other selves living and loving and working, sleeping and suffering and struggling. She saw that on a day she had made her great resolve to help the world. I will return, I will, I will. And now she knew what things they were she had seemed to remember in the king's garden of delight. Joyously, eagerly, willingly, she saw that she had determined to return to earth in body after body, to help the men of sorrow who struggled and slumbered and suffered. She saw that she had before so done, that her work remained unfinished, to be begun again where she had laid it down. There was suffering shown to her in the cup, there was sorrow and grief and pain, but she saw that it must all be, and was content. For at other times she had desired just such things, that she might know how others felt them, that she might help them the more with understanding. Happiness she had taken to give to others, and she must repay the debt. She saw that all things were just, and when the musician said, in a low voice, "Will you yet proceed?" "I will," she said. "Then drink the cup," he said. "Drink." She drained the green cup of the lotus leaf until scarcely a drop remained, and with that draught she forgot all things that had been, the garden, the king, the journey and the vision, and the master harper, all were forgotten. Only there remained dim remembrance as of a dream at dawn forgotten. 4. A little ship stood by the shore of the great sea. Into this Eline entered. There were other ships, some better, some worse, but somehow she knew that just this, and not another, was the ship she wanted, and none questioned her when she entered. So they sailed away towards the setting sun. Long was the voyage and lonely, for the seas ran high, and all was dark below in the heart of the ship. 9 months they sailed on the ocean, until in the time appointed land appeared. Strange dwellings were there, domes and spires and crowded cities. With wide, wondering eyes, Eline watched them as the ship passed them by in strange procession. For the men of that land were like none she knew. None of these things could she remember, for she had forgotten even her name at the river of forgetfulness, where remembrances are left in the mirror of the waters until time and their Creator bring them back to life. It seemed as though one of wise and kindly countenance held her as a little child in his arms and whispered softly, "Remember, I will return, I will, I will." A light of happy recollection came to her, and she smiled in reply. He had spoken in her own language, as the harp had spoken, and strangely she seemed to see in him the harper whose music had told her of the sorrowful land beyond the sunset. For this moment she remembered, and then the thought departed. At first the air seemed heavy and oppressive to the wanderer, but by degrees she grew accustomed to it, and even in time scarcely felt it. Yet ever and again a dim remembrance of brighter, purer skies came to her. She spoke of this more than once, but others only laughed and said, "The child is dreaming." Because she was no longer dressed in shining garments, they did not know her for the princess she really was. Indeed, she was no way different from those around her, but that at heart she was still the daughter of the king. They could not see her heart, this they could not know. And seeing that they did not understand, she said no more of the thoughts that came to her. They called it dreaming, but Eline thought if this were so, a dream were better than waking life, unless— Could these be thoughts that came to her of the world beyond the water, the reflection of the real life? She knew not. "We must teach this little dreamer what is life," they said. "She will not know what life is if we leave her to her dreams." They made her work and made her play, work that never seemed to do anyone any good, and play that seemed like work. She nearly forgot that in what they called her dreams she had ever known of another life. Sometimes she sang to herself, strange songs that they said sounded sad and sorrowful, yet of a sweetness all their own. "Where does she hear them?" people asked. But Eline never told, for the truth was that they came to her in moments when her thoughts were far away, dreaming. "She sings like a bird in a cage that knows of a brighter world outside," said one. But he was a poet, so they only smiled as if they themselves would have made the same remark if it had not been so fanciful. And though men thought her sad and lonely, there was joy to her in the hum of the bees and the songs of the birds and the rustling of the leaves. The butterflies and the flowers and the brooks were her friends. "What a strange child," people said when they heard her talking to these friends. They did not know of the stories her friends had told her, stories which reminded her of a wonderful garden of delight where men did not ever stare and stare in gaping wonder, because a little child talked with the fairies that live in all things beautiful, clothed in robes of sunlight and rainbow hues. They would have taken her away from these friends but for one old man, her grandfather, who said, "The child will be better for the fresh air. Let her live while she may." So it was that she played and talked with the flowers and sang to the brooks and listened to the stories of the forest trees that whispered among themselves. None dared take her away. One day she had been for a long ramble by a mighty river, and the sun had sunk to the westward on its journey, but she turned not to the place she called her home. Tired and worn out with her play, she lay on a rock and slept. In her sleep it seemed that a touch upon her forehead awakened in her a vision of things she had once known, but had now almost forgotten. There was the king's garden and the palace, and the other wonderful buildings, tall and stately, mighty buildings which seemed to speak of mighty builders, noble thoughts and great men's deeds. Some were even more stately, some more humble than the palace. But in all there was a sense of grander, nobler life than the life those knew who were with her now, and who, laughing, called her a dreamer. And she heard a voice repeating, "I will return, I will, I will." Again she smiled as she recognized the voice. A feeling of intense happiness and content came to her, and she awoke. More than ever it seemed as if that other were the real life, and this a heavy dream. 5. The twilight glow still lingered in the west, and the evening breeze called her to thoughts of home. But she had learned wisdom, and when they asked her where she had been, Eline said she had fallen asleep in the sunshine on a rock by the great river, which was true. Of her dream she said nothing to any except to the old man, who alone seemed to understand her a little. He did not laugh, but looked with thoughtful eyes intent into the distance, away to the starlit sky, and it seemed to her that he was trying to remember a forgotten dream of life. And seeing this, she put her hand in his trustingly, and they two knew well each other's thoughts, though never a word was spoken. It seemed to the old man that the child was leading him along a familiar road to a home forgotten, after many weary days of wandering. "There are some things the heart can say that words can never tell," he said to himself when she was gone. "I think we understand one another." As time passed by, Eline came to know more and more of that other life, and she longed to tell these things to the people who struggled and surged, in hot strife to win the things of the world they knew, never thinking that there was a happier, purer, brighter world. Some thought they knew of such a one, but all except a few made it seem like the one in which they lived, only they made it a little more bright by day, a little more dark by night, and with a little more success in the strife for the things that change and pass away. These she would tell of the nobler life she knew, but they listened not at all. In due time Aileen was sent to school to learn, but her teachers found little that she did not quickly understand. For one thing, she remembered now plainly how in the Garden of Delight everything that was done was well done, were it the telling of a story or the singing of a song or the watering of the flowers that grew in that fair land. All was done with a wonderful thoroughness, and Aileen now felt that she must do all things in that way or leave them quite alone. But often they would teach Aileen things about which she seemed to care little and to understand as one in a dream. Then they would call her attention to the work only to find that she was learning to understand a great deal more than they themselves could tell. It was so with numbers. When they asked her what the numbers were by name, she not only named them all, but told them why they were so named and what each meant. And so with music. With every chord she seemed to see harmonies of color, like beautiful pictures too glorious to paint. And when she said that life itself to her was music, Aileen's teachers did not understand. One said, "She has learned these things before in another life." Another declared, "She sees the heart of things where we see only the outer covering. She sees the soul, we the body." Perhaps they both were right. But many gave other reasons for these things, and all of them were gravely discussed. But curiously enough, the two who gave the reasons I have told were laughed at and told that such things could not be. So they said little about their thoughts, because, like all those who are sure that they know the truth, they could afford to wait until their words were proved to be right. 6. At first Aileen longed to tell the world of better things. She would gladly have told the world of the glorious masonry of those noble cities which she saw in her visions. Cities where men and women moved like gods, where sorrow and want and selfishness seemed to be unknown. She longed to tell them of the harmonies which came to her of music which might stir a dead world to life, thrilling all nature into blossoms and fruits in abundance, as the music of a waterfall seems to send life into the flowers which grow beside. She would have told them of the colors with which nature loves to paint the sky, the mountains and valleys, sea and land, when all is ready for the master's work. For nature paints wherever the canvas is prepared to receive the picture, and she asks no price for her work. Aileen knew of times in the past, times that will come again, when man did not ever strive to be rich regardless of his poorer brothers, but each worked as he was able, all working for the whole world's good. And she would have told them how in those times man did not earn his living by toil unending, by ceaseless pain and sorrow, but that nature helped him as he helped her, and the earth brought out her stores of rich fruits for the welfare of her upgrown sons, well knowing that they in turn with loving service would seek to make nobler and better that which nature gave to them in charge, birds and beasts, flowers and trees, plants and stones and all that lives, which is everything. Aileen saw how the desire to possess more than enough for the selfish pleasures of saying, "It is mine," how the growth of selfishness in the world, the love of killing nature's younger sons for food and pleasure increased, how the love of ease and forgetfulness of others and of duty to Mother Nature, how all these things had chilled the warmth of the one great life that is in all things, and crippled the mother's efforts to help her wayward sons. Others had told these things. Others had striven to show the glorious light of life that shines behind the cold mist of sin and sorrow which has been cast like a veil over the earth. But all had been rejected. Some were ill received, some were stoned, some were killed. How can I raise this humanity which like a great orphan has cut itself off from its mother, and now lies ignorant of the happiness that awaits its coming, thought Eline. I have returned to tell them of the way, and they will not hear. Others have returned as far as they might and have been rejected. Others still have boldly plunged deeper yet in the hot sea of human life and been lost in its poisonous fumes. Even so, I will again return, yet lower, if by chance there be a few who will not reject my message. 7. So Eline hid in her heart the things she knew and the things she would have told, as she had hidden in her soul at the river of forgetfulness the memory of the king's garden of delight. And she took her way into the world with messages of love and of hope, such simple messages as the children understood, better sometimes than their elders. She told the children many beautiful fairy stories, and they listened eagerly. They did not know that these were the stories which she had told to the learned ones of earth, and which were really true, though they had not believed. The children listened, and they said, "It is beautiful. Some day we will seek out such a beautiful world as that of which the stories tell." There were houses, too, which they built, little toy houses with toy bricks. But Eline showed them how to shape the bricks and how to make each brick fit in its proper place, so that never a one should lose its worth. And Eline showed the children how that behind the building of beautiful mansions there was the beautiful thought that made the masonry so noble a work, though it were only toy masonry. And the children understood. In their games they had done each his best, and they did well. But Eline showed them games in which they all acted together, even the little ones helping and sharing. It was wonderful to them that they had not thought of this before, because now they found that they could do more than ever they had done when each worked alone and for himself. Near the city where they dwelt was a vast plain full of great boulders, which they could have made into a great park and a beautiful garden, but the people of the city cared not for such things and would not help them. By themselves they knew not how to move the rocks, so it remained a waste of wild growth, except in those places where the children had moved, one by one, and with great difficulty, the smaller stones. Now Eline bid them take a strong rope. "For," said she, "we will clear that plain, and it shall be for a dwelling and a garden for all." She was thinking of the king's garden. The children looked at her in astonishment, as though they wondered if she meant the thing she said. "We have no rope," they said, "and none will give us any." "There is your rope," said Eline, pointing out the overgrown plain, where, amid the rocks, in the great patches from which they had slowly and painfully drawn the smaller stones, grew masses of pale blue flowers, beautiful, delicate little blossoms, like wind flowers. Again the children looked at her, questioningly, not as the people at first had done, but trustingly, though they knew not what she would have them do, but sought to learn her wishes. So at her bidding they gathered all the ripened stalks of the little flowers and laid them out in the sun as she directed. Almost it seemed a pity to destroy the plants. One little worker asked Eline of this matter, for he loved the flowers and was sorry to see them gathered and dried. "Does it not hurt the flowers to pluck them?" he asked. "Some say that you can talk with them as with all living things, and you can tell if the flowers do not suffer in the gathering, although they are old and ripe." His was a loving heart, and Eline saw that he asked this out of no mere curiosity. Gently she touched his forehead with her finger. "Look," she said, "look and listen, for I have opened the seeing eye to you." 8. And the boy looked around in wonderment, amazed, and saw that the whole great plain was full of teeming life which he had not before seen. Fairies and elves peeped from every flower, gnomes and earthmen worked and played and danced among the boulders. And where before was silence but for the rustling of the leaves in the breeze, there rose a murmur of many voices, like the humming of bees in the sunshine. The boy listened, and at once he knew what the flowers were whispering. "There is a saying that the flax people are being used for a mighty work," said one little blue fairy to another. "I heard a bee spreading the news," said another. "All the flax people are asked to give their dresses to help in clearing the plain for a palace and a garden where the kings may dwell. Not kings of earth and of little cities, but kings of wisdom whom nature loves to obey, and we among her children." "Body after body have I grown," said the other. "I have struggled and striven to grow useful in this glorious brotherhood of nature, and my only success seems to be that I have a pretty head. It is good to be beautiful, perhaps, but I've always thought that I would sacrifice my beauty for a chance of sharing in noble deeds." A butterfly that had stopped to listen now spoke to her. "You have waited, and now you will have your reward, for surely your body will be taken to help in the work that is going forward. The flax people have indeed lived to good purpose." "They certainly do not seem afraid to die," said the boy to himself. And as if in answer to his whispered thought, the little flax fairy said, "Of course we are not afraid. I have been told that there are giants of men who really think that when they leave their worn-out stalks, bodies they call them, behind, they live no more, or at least are not sure what becomes of themselves. But it cannot be true. It must be a fairy story," laughed the little elf. "They must know, as we know, that all things sleep a while and then take new bodies like dresses woven while they worked in their last awaking which men call life. And then one day we know that we shall have woven dresses so fine that we shall be free to leave them as the butterfly leaves his dull-hued robes and spreads his bright wings for flight into the grand unknown, which we all long to know." "But how do you know that these things are so?" asked the boy. "How do I know that I am alive?" answered the flax fairy in a murmur. Fainter grew the voices, and the vision faded from the boy's sight. He knew not how long it was he stayed there, but after a while he awoke with a start to find that Aileen was no longer with him, and that he had slept among the flax in the sunshine. 9. "It must have been a dream," he said. But he did not believe it was a dream, for all his words. And really the flowers seemed to him to bear a new life after that wonderful vision which came to him when Aileen gave him for an hour the seeing eye. Working with the others joyfully and happily without a moment's pause or one thought of failure, they saw quickly growing an immense heap of beautiful fine white thread. The children had helped the flax to grow, and now, in turn, it aided them to clear more ground. For in no long time all was finished, and before them they had a mighty rope, growing greater every day under their leader's eye. One strange thing there was about the rope, for there were golden threads interwoven which the children did not remember having seen among the flax, and they wondered. But Aileen only said, "It is golden flax." Whatever it was, it shone brightly in the sun until it looked like a ray of real sunlight in the rope. One little child said, "It looks like a brother to the sun." "Perhaps it is," said Aileen, and smiled. The work grew apace, and the play grew apace, because the children scarcely knew which was work and which was play. They seemed to have found something better than both. Stone after stone, rock after rock, was encircled with the cord and triumphantly drawn by that merry army of children to the edge of the plain. Clearer and clearer grew the space. Where before the stones had been, little pools of water formed, while round them grew masses of beautiful flowers, among which was a new crop of the little blue flax, stronger and better grown than any that had been there before. Gradually there grew up a great wall of rock around the plain where the boulders were drawn by the children, for each was taken to its nearest boundary, as Aileen told them this would be the simplest way to clear the plain. Some mighty rocks yet remained in the center of the plain, but the children had so seen the wisdom of their leader that they doubted not that these too would be removed without difficulty, although how this was to be done they could not tell. And as the work was nearing an end, they did as their leader bid them in perfect trust. Actually, they put their ropes around a rock which some said was like a small mountain. They pulled with a will, but the rock moved not. Still they pulled, willingly and with all their might, for now they had grown strong until they scarcely knew their own powers. From the great city, from the mountains, and from the country round about, came sightseers and inquirers. At first they only laughed and talked, and helped not at all. But among them came men of strange countenance, strong men, wise in looks, men of kingly bearing. These said, "It is not right that these children should work forever alone." And they too, with strong grip of a strange sort, laid hold of the golden ropes, seeing which the idlers too came and helped, until with a mighty song of joy the children saw the great rock move, slowly at first, then faster, faster, until with a run they had placed it in a far corner of the great plain, standing like a sentinel to the north. 10. Another and yet others followed. East and south and west the unhewn boulders stood like guardians of the plain. A circle of 12 yet remained in the center like giant pillars supporting the sky. But these Eileen said should stand, as also some smaller ones which were placed across their tops like great beams resting upon a doorway. How this was done I cannot say, but there is a saying in the city that in the night before they were found placed high above the giant circle, the sound of a great and joyous song, a hymn of power, was heard like the tones of a great bell shaking the houses with its vibrations, and putting men in fear of the destruction of their city. But at sunset the children had not returned from the plain, so that they were not in the city when this happened. And not until the sunrise did the people flock to the doors and windows for a glimpse of the joyous army that marched in their streets. Led by the men of kingly bearing, the children marched, singing a song of triumph, with such shining glory in their faces that all the people marveled. Tired they were, and slept. But when in the late noontide the people asked them what had happened, all seemed like the forgotten glory of a dream. They could remember little except that they were filled with the joy of wonderful things which no tongue could tell. The work had not taken 1 day or 2, but many days. Months and even years had passed since the children played together in the sunshine. Strong and sturdy lads and lasses were they now. A beautiful temple had arisen within the giant circle, and all around it was a garden of beauty like no garden which they had seen. But when Eileen looked amid the rare flowers and found a little purple star with heart of gold, she knew that it was a flower from the king's garden, and she was glad that it could grow where all was rock before. There were great purple pansies, too, like thoughts from the palace in which Eileen had lived. Now it was that the children came to the temple to learn of Eileen, and she taught them the wonderful truths which she knew. To them she told the wonderful things that have been, and the more wonderful things that may be, if men will only try to bring them about. She taught them things so simple that they often wondered why they had not already known them without the telling. They did not know that there was a good reason why it should be so. Eileen taught them, too, how by all working together for the welfare and progress of all, there is no task we may not overcome. "We know it," said the children, remembering the waste of rocks in the plain where now the garden stood and the temple. "Each by himself can do much, but all working together can move the world," she said. "Now I will tell you a strange thing, which is yet true. For we are not at all separate from any other thing in the world, but the same nature is in us as in them, in the rocks and the flowers, in the forests and streams, in city and mountain, in air and fire and water, just as the rocks and this temple are of the same stone, although they differ in shape. And if we only will, we can make all our rocks into beautiful, glorious temples. When the world of men has learned this lesson, the earth itself will become a mighty temple, that the wise teachers of old, whom men call gods, may come to us again and live with us in peace forevermore. And it shall be known that music is life. For in music is harmony, and by harmony all things live, each note in its own place, doing its perfect work, be it great or small. For this, too, is a brotherhood of harmony. Because in those days the people listened to the teachings from the temple and to the great ones who came to dwell therein when it was finished, and who taught the seekers after truth through their messenger Eileen, there were happiness and joy and peace in all the land. Men became nobler as they thought of nobler things than had hitherto been their custom. Seeing the beauty of the temple and the mighty work that comes of aiding nature, working in unity and harmony, they also built their houses to be like the temple. Stone they used for brick. Beautiful they built them within and without, and they labored to make their dwellings fit temples for the gods. For it was said among them that sometimes strangers would visit their city, and seeking entrance would dwell with them a while where they found a welcome. And it was noticed that always they came to such dwellings as those where the beauty and harmony of the building showed beauty and harmony within. And when they left the house, there always seemed to remain a memory of their presence, as a ray of light at sunset leaves a memory of joyous days, and a sense of hope for brighter days yet to come. When this thing happened, the neighbors would gather together, and it was said, "The Master has built the house." Then the great beam which rested on the pillars of the doors was lifted, and where it had stood was built an arch of stone, and last of all was dropped in place the keystone which held the arch. And there was great rejoicing, for the people said, "The house is finished." Some there were who would have lifted the beam and built the arch, but unless the Master had been in the house, always some accident would occur and the house be destroyed. In the center of the arch was placed a great light which was ever kept burning, for it was fed with oil of gold which never burns away, but whose smoke ever turns to oil again. Each light was like the greater light which ever shone from the dome of the temple, a light to lighten all around. Such light as it was said went out to the world from the temple itself in the knowledge of the laws of life and of all things good and great and beautiful. Never was the light to be put out, lest harm should come. Day and night it was held a sacred duty to guard the light. When that light shone, there was peace and plenty in the land, for fellowship made life joyful. Some called that glorious time the Golden Age. Some there are even now among us who will bring that golden age again to earth as then, through brotherhood and the joy of life, that misery shall not always be among us, nor poverty, sorrow, and pain. 11. But there came a day when messengers from far-off lands came over sea a great journey to the temple, and to Eileen they told the despair and want and the madness of unbrotherliness that men knew in the countries whence they came, countries where the light shone no longer. Of wars and of famines they spoke, of poverty, oppression, and crime. Eileen's great compassion could not be silent to appeal. "From these things I say humanity shall be saved," said she. "I have a duty here, but there are guardians in the temple, and the call comes loud to me from the world beyond. I will go." Those messengers heard with joy of the success of their journey, for they had traveled far and had overcome many trials and difficulties by the way. And all the time they had hoped in perfect faith that they would return with some encouragement to the country whence they came. And doubtless it was because of the grand faith they showed that Eileen herself answered their call. "Guard well the temple while I am away," Eileen charged her people. "I must travel far, but in no time I will return. I will return. Be watchful, therefore, that the light be burning, that the oil fade not. None can tell the time of the coming, whether it be by night or day. With your lives must you guard the light." She spoke somewhat sadly, as it seemed to them, and they supposed she thought of the great misery and need of those she went to succor in their distress. And they answered the more eagerly, "We will, we will." For the first time since it had been built, the temple was left without its head, a sacred trust indeed. They thought they knew themselves. They thought they knew the evil in their natures and the good, did those temple watchers. And in their surety of knowing they grew careless, so that in no long time they lost their caution. Some there were who were faithless, and these began to tell them of their great success, how they had built the temple, how their industry and labor had succeeded, how well they had learned to know themselves. Gently they suggested these things. Gently these sayings took root, almost unperceived. Our temple which we have built is very mighty. It can never fail, they said. Some few there were who would have spoken for Aileen, but they were timid and afraid of those who talked so boastfully. Wherefore they were silent. It is true that one or two attempted to recall the noble deeds of the absent one, and to point out that she had really built the temple. They had supplied only the labor, yet the fruits of it were theirs and the world's. True, said the wicked and faithless ones, she had a great mind for building, but she made mistakes. She herself said so. We have learned by those mistakes, and we know. She would have made the temple's teachings too common altogether. Why, she actually began to turn into a teacher of virtues of which the world is weary, instead of building as at first. She had taught all she knew, but we can teach greater things and better things. We can teach the world 20 different styles of building in metals, wood, stone, and marble, of ornaments and decorations enough to last for a century. Thus we honor her. Thus we carry on her work and make it grow, although she made mistakes. Indeed, she did make mistakes, said one, and the greatest mistake of all was when she chose such faithless craftsmen for the temple work. Shame on you. O faithful one, said they, such faith deserves a great reward. To you we will entrust the duty of finding her. We will give you all you need for the voyage, a ship and provisions enough for a year. 12. So those treacherous ones cast adrift on the ocean the one who remained faithful, and those others who would have spoken out for their absent teacher were silenced against their own better natures, for those wicked ones had been great among them, and they were afraid. It was thought that in no long time the winds and waves would destroy the little ship with its lonely voyager. Yet with stout heart, knowing that he might not return alone, he held on fearless and determined. Sometimes it seems that those who so follow the voice of their inner wisdom in dauntless courage are helped by nature, as though she ever loved such brave hearts. I have heard the story told how the great Columbus who found a new world was beset by his followers to return. How nature sent him messages that he was nearing land, birds and driftwood, branches of trees and floating weed. He read the message with the eyes of one who loves all nature well, and promised sight of land to his men in 3 days, a promise that was fulfilled. So it was that the little ship with the one who remained faithful did a greater work than ever those desired who sent it. Slowly, slowly, in the temple, it came about that the guardians forgot their duty, forgot that they were there to guard the temple in sacred trust for humanity. And as the wicked ones among them wished, they busied themselves about many things, but not the one thing needful, the welfare and the progress of mankind. How can the tale be told? A tale that is new, yet old, old beyond count of years. For the enemies of the world, with whom those wicked ones were leagued, came suddenly by night, when the sacred lamp which sent rays of hope over the great ocean was allowed to flicker and go out. And those enemies destroyed the temple, so that scarcely one stone remained upon another. And with it were destroyed those weak ones who failed in their trust. All perished, and with them perished for a time the light of the world. 13. It is said, how truly I know not, that beneath the foundation pillars of the temple was wisely prepared by Aileen a vault, a vast cave wherein were hidden the most sacred records of the temple, and the sacred secret name which they had forgotten. To her over the sea came the knowledge of the faithless guard, and in her agony she called upon that sacred name, if by chance the temple should be saved. In days of old men knew that there is a power in words, a power now forgotten. Stories there are which tell of city walls falling at a trumpet blast, of cities rising as if by magic at a word, of mighty doors thrown open, of nature spellbound by a song, of mighty names the jinns and genii of the desert obey. And this sacred name was such a one as these, for with its whispering a mighty thrill passed out over the world, and the foundations of the sea were shaken. Vast continents were destroyed, and men said the world was at an end. Terrible was the time, but Eline knew that it was better so, for the remnant of the living might one day restore the ancient glory of that land. But had it been that the land remained, those wicked ones would have lived and worked to destroy the whole world, so that not even a remnant should be left in the bosom of the waters to repeople the earth. After many days, tossed and beaten by the waves, the little ship with the outcast faithful one came drifting to the land where Eline was. The winds and the sea conspired, as it seemed, to urge the ship on her voyage, and the dwellers of the ocean pointed the way, watchful ever and untiring in their duty. Small as it was, and ill-found, Eline chose this ship for her return, and once again she came to the place where the temple had stood, she and that faithful one. She gazed at the ruins of that sacred spot, and sadly looked at the tops of the mighty pillars just rising above the waves of the sea, which at times filled the arches in between so that no man might pass beneath. Unseen guards there were, Eline knew, guards who would keep that spot free for future generations of a world to come. Water nymphs, sea sprites, and earth goblins, undines, gnomes, and sylphs dwelt there as sentinels of a sacred trust, and Eline was content to go. For, she said, the secret vault of the sacred name yet stands intact until these same faithless ones shall come again, purified by many wanderings and trials, and shall again guard that new, old temple with me. That time they shall not fail. And a ray of glorious hope shone in her face as she left the ruined temple. "I will return," she said. "I will return." End of The Strange Little Girl by V.M. Recording by Tim Freeberg Renwick.
The Two Skyscrapers Who Decided to Have a Child by Carl Sandburg. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Two skyscrapers stood across the street from each other in the village of Liver and Onions. In the daylight, when the streets poured full of people buying and selling, these two skyscrapers talked with each other the same as mountains talk. In the night time, when all the people buying and selling were gone home and there were only policemen and taxicab drivers on the streets, in the night when a mist crept up the streets and threw a purple and gray wrapper over everything, in the night when the stars and the sky shook out sheets of purple and gray mist down over the town, then the two skyscrapers leaned toward each other and whispered. Whether they whispered secrets to each other, or whether they whispered simple things that you and I know and everybody knows, that is their secret. One thing is sure. They often were seen leaning toward each other and whispering in the night, the same as mountains lean and whisper in the night. High on the roof of one of the skyscrapers was a tin brass goat, looking out across prairies and silver-blue lakes shining like blue porcelain breakfast plates, and out across silver snakes of winding rivers in the morning sun. And high on the roof of the other skyscraper was a tin brass goose, looking out across prairies and silver blue lakes shining like blue porcelain breakfast plates, and out across silver snakes of winding rivers in the morning sun. Now the northwest wind was a friend of the two skyscrapers. Coming so far, coming 500 miles in a few hours, coming so fast always, while the skyscrapers were standing still, standing always on the same old street corners, always. The northwest wind was a bringer of news. "Well, I see the city is here yet," the northwest wind would whistle to the skyscrapers. And they would answer, "Yes. And are the mountains standing yet way out yonder where you come from, wind?" "Yes, the mountains are there yonder, and farther yonder is the sea, and the railroads are still going, still running across the prairie to the mountains, to the sea," the northwest wind would answer. And now there was a pledge made by the northwest wind to the two skyscrapers. Often the northwest wind shook the tin brass goat and shook the tin brass goose on top of the skyscrapers. "Are you going to blow loose the tin brass goat on my roof?" one asked. "Are you going to blow loose the tin brass goose on my roof?" the other asked. "Oh, no," the northwest wind laughed, first to one and then to the other. "If I ever blow loose your tin brass goat, and if I ever blow loose your tin brass goose, it will be when I am sorry for you, because you are up against hard luck, and there is somebody's funeral." So time passed on, and the two skyscrapers stood with their feet among the policemen and the taxicabs, the people buying and selling, the customers with parcels, packages, and bundles, while away high on their roofs stood the goat and the goose, looking out on silver blue lakes like blue porcelain breakfast plates, and silver snakes of rivers winding in the morning sun. So time passed on, and the northwest wind kept coming, telling the news and making promises. So time passed on, and the two skyscrapers decided to have a child. And they decided when their child came, it should be a free child. "It must be a free child," they said to each other. "It must not be a child standing still all its life on a street corner. Yes, if we have a child, she must be free to run across the prairie, to the mountains, to the sea. Yes, it must be a free child." So time passed on. Their child came. It was a railroad train, the Golden Spike Limited, the fastest long-distance train in the Rutabaga country. It ran across the prairie, to the mountains, to the sea. They were glad, the two skyscrapers were, glad to have a free child running away from the big city, far away to the mountains, far away to the sea, running as far as the farthest mountains and sea coasts touched by the northwest wind. They were glad their child was useful, the two skyscrapers were, glad their child was carrying 1,000 people 1,000 miles a day. So when people spoke of the Golden Spike Limited, they spoke of it as a strong, lovely child. Then time passed on. There came a day when the newsies yelled as though they were crazy. "Ya, ya, blah, blah, yo, yo," was what it sounded like to the two skyscrapers, who never bothered much about what the newsies were yelling. "Ya, ya, blah, blah, yo, yo," was the cry of the newsies that came up again to the tops of the skyscrapers. At last the yelling of the newsies came so strong that the skyscrapers listened and heard the newsies yammering, all about the great train wreck, all about the Golden Spike disaster, many lives lost, many lives lost. And the northwest wind came howling a slow, sad song, and late that afternoon a crowd of policemen, taxicab drivers, newsies, and customers with bundles all stood around talking and wondering about two things next to each other on the streetcar track in the middle of the street. One was a tin brass goat, the other was a tin brass goose, and they lay next to each other. End of The Two Skyscrapers Who Decided to Have a Child by Carl Sandburg. Read by Winston Tharp.
David the Shepherd Boy by Amy Steedman. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. David the Shepherd Boy. Up amongst the hills, perched like the nest of a bird on one of the long, low ridges, lies the little town of Bethlehem. It was but a small town at the time this story begins, and there was nothing about it to make it at all famous. It lay out of the beaten track, and anyone wanting to visit it must needs climb the long, winding road that led from the plain beneath, through olive groves and sheep fields, up to the city gate, a steep, difficult road leading nowhere but to the little town itself. It was in these fields on the slope of the hills that David, the shepherd boy of Bethlehem, spent his days watching his father's flocks. That father, whose name was Jesse, was one of the chief men of the town, and David was the youngest of all his sons. There were 7 big brothers at home, and it was no wonder Jesse was proud of his sons. They were tall, splendid young men, all of them doing men's work now, and taking very little notice of the youngest, who was still only a small boy, chiefly useful in looking after the sheep. But though David was but little thought of, no one could say that he did not do his work well. There was not a more careful or watchful shepherd on all the hills around Bethlehem. He knew each one of his sheep, and never allowed one to stray. He always led them to the best pasture, and found the coolest and freshest water for them to drink. Then, too, he was as brave as a lion, and if any wild beast came lurking round hoping to snatch a lamb away, David was up at once and would attack the fiercest beast single-handed. Nothing could ever do any harm to his flock. Now it happened that one day, while David was, as usual, out in the fields, that a sudden stir of excitement awoke in the little town of Bethlehem. Men gathered round the city gate, and with anxious, fearful eyes looked down the long, white road that led up from the plain below. And yet there seemed nothing there to make them look so terrified and anxious. Only an old, feeble man was slowly climbing up towards the town. He was driving a heifer before him, and carrying what looked like a horn in his hand. But the people whispered together that the old man was none other than Samuel, the prophet of the Lord, who carried God's messages. He must be bringing a message to them, and who knew if it was good or evil? They tried with uneasy minds to remember if they had been doing anything wrong of late, as they watched the old man drawing nearer and nearer. Then at last the chief men of the town went out to meet him. "Comest thou peaceably?" they asked anxiously. The old man lifted his head and looked at them kindly as he echoed the words. "Peaceably," he answered at once. "I am come to sacrifice unto the Lord." A great sigh of relief went up from the people. The visit was a mark of God's favor and not of his displeasure. It was true, indeed, that Samuel had come to offer sacrifice, but he had come also on a secret errand about which no man knew but himself. God had bidden him take his horn of oil and anoint one of the sons of Jesse to be king over his people instead of Saul, the present king, who had displeased him. But it was to be done secretly. Saul must not hear of it, or his vengeance would be swift. It was in Jesse's house that the feast of the sacrifice was prepared, and Samuel ordered that all the sons of the house should pass before him as they went to attend the sacrifice. The first to come was Eliab, Jesse's eldest son, and when Samuel saw him, he felt sure that this was the man who was to be anointed king. He was a splendid young man, tall and strong and handsome, looking almost as kingly as Saul himself. "Surely this is he," murmured Samuel to himself. But God's answer came quickly. No, this was not the man. Samuel saw only the outward signs of strength and beauty, but God saw deeper into the heart. So the eldest son passed on, and one by one the 6 brothers followed, all sons that a father might well be proud of. But God sent no sign to show that any of them was the chosen king. Samuel was puzzled. What could it mean? Then he turned again to Jesse. "Are here all thy children?" he asked. Surprised at the question, Jesse suddenly remembered the little lad, his youngest son, who was out in the fields tending the sheep. Was it possible that Samuel had any use for him? "Send and fetch him," ordered Samuel instantly, "for we will not sit down till he comes hither." So a messenger was sent in haste to bring David, and presently he came hurrying in, and as soon as Samuel saw him, he knew his search was ended. He was only a little shepherd lad with the breath of the hills about him, his golden hair tossed by the wind, his fair face flushed, and his sunburned hand holding his shepherd's crook. But there was no doubt that God had chosen him. "Arise and anoint him, for this is he," said God's voice in Samuel's heart. Slowly, then, the old man rose and held the oil aloft and poured it upon the boy's bowed head, while the rest of the company looked silently on. They were puzzled to know what it all meant. Perhaps the elder brothers were envious and wondered why this mere child should be singled out for special favor. But no one dared to question God's messenger. Nothing further happened just then. Samuel returned as he had come by the winding white road, and before long his visit was forgotten as the people settled to their work again. Only David, out in the fields, thought more and more about what had happened, and grew more and more certain that it had been a call from God to do some special work for him. The wonder of it filled his mind, but it never interfered with his work. There was little time for idle dreaming in the boy's life. He was as watchful as ever in his care for his sheep, and as courageous as ever in guarding them from prowling beasts. Even in his leisure time he was busy too, and there was not one of the sunny hours of daylight that he wasted. He loved music, and he taught himself to play on the harp, practicing so carefully and patiently that his fingers grew most wonderfully skillful. Then he made songs to go to the music, some of the most beautiful songs that ever have been made in all the world. Almost every child today knows his beautiful song about the Good Shepherd. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." There was another thing, too, that he learned to do with the same care and patient perseverance, and that was to use his shepherd's sling. There was no boy in all Bethlehem who could shoot as straight as he could. He never missed his mark. It was no great thing, perhaps, to make music and aim straight, but it was a great thing to do what lay nearest his hand with all his might. Perhaps some day God would make use of his singing, or have some work for a boy who had a quick eye and a sure aim. Who could tell? So David learned to do his very best, and before very long God's call came to him. Saul, the king of Israel, sat day after day in his darkened tent, ill and full of misery. No one dared to go near him, and his servants whispered together, "It is an evil spirit from the Lord that troubles him." Then someone suggested that perhaps music might help to cheer him and drive the evil spirit from him. "Let our Lord now command thy servants to seek out a man who is a cunning player on the harp," they said to the king. "And it shall come to pass that when the evil spirit from God is upon thee, he shall play with his hand, and thou shalt be well." Saul listened to their words, and hope crept into his heart. "Provide me now a man that can play well, and bring him unto me," he said eagerly. Now the fame of David's playing and singing had spread even beyond Bethlehem. "We must send for David, the son of Jesse," said one of the king's servants at once. He was the very person they wanted. Not only could he sing and play, but he was a good boy, brave and fearless, and best of all, as the servant said, "The Lord is with him." So the shepherd boy was brought to the king's darkened tent, ready to do his bidding. Sitting there in the dim light, he drew such magic music from his harp strings, and sang such sweet songs, that the very song of the birds seemed to be filling the tent. The king, as he listened, seemed to feel the breath of the mountain fields, to hear the call of the sheepfold and the murmur of the dancing streams. It acted like a charm. The black misery was lifted from his heart, and the evil spirit was put to flight by the song of the shepherd boy. It was no wonder, then, that the king, for a time at least, loved the boy with his bright face and sunny hair, and wanted to keep him as his armor-bearer. But perhaps, as Saul grew well and had no further need of the music, David was no longer wanted, and so he went back again to the Bethlehem fields to look after his sheep. God had made use of David's skill in music, and before very long another call came to him. This time the need was for one who could aim straight, who had a quick eye and a steady hand. War had broken out. The fierce Philistines had come up with their great armies to try and conquer the land. Every man in Israel who could fight was called up to protect his country. Already David's 3 elder brothers had joined Saul's army, which was preparing to fight the enemy. On either side of a narrow valley, divided by a stream which ran along over smooth stones, the 2 armies faced each other. There they were encamped, like wild beasts, ready to fly at each other's throats. At any moment the fight might begin, and that stream be stained red with blood. Only the Philistines were far the strongest, and the Israelites had but little chance of victory. This valley was 7 or 8 miles distant from the little town of Bethlehem, and Jesse waited anxiously, day after day, for news of his 3 sons. At last he could bear the anxiety no longer, and he determined to send David to the camp to carry food to the brothers and bring back news how they fared. So very early one morning David set out on his errand. He had carefully put his sheep under the care of another shepherd, and he took with him parched corn and loaves of bread for his brothers, as well as 10 cheeses which his father was sending to the officers under whom they served. It was not long before the boy came within sight of the valley, and his heart began to beat with excitement, for he saw that he had arrived just as something was about to happen. The armies were drawn up in a battle array, and suddenly a great shout went up from both sides. It was the battle cry of the 2 armies which sounded in his ears. There was no time now to carry food or gifts, so David quickly left his load at the entrance to the camp and hurried on to search for his brothers. He had learned to find his way about a camp where for a short time he had been Saul's armor-bearer, so now he went swiftly among the soldiers, until at last he found his brothers. Were they well? He eagerly asked them. And what were they doing? But even while he spoke, there was a stir among the Philistines, and all eyes were turned to watch. All ears were strained to hear the enemy's challenge, which rang out clearly across the narrow valley. Out of the rank of the Philistines there had stepped a man so tall and strong that he appeared to be a giant. He was more than 9 feet high, and the armor which he wore was so solid and heavy that it would have crushed any ordinary man to the earth. This was Goliath, the great champion of the Philistines. Every morning and every evening he strode proudly out and defied the Israelites, bidding them find a champion who would come and fight with him. Once again his challenge rang out on the clear air. "Choose you a man for you, and let him come down to me. If he be able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall ye be our servants and serve us. I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." A great silence fell after the champion had shouted his last words of defiance. There was no answer from the Israelites. No man had courage enough to dream of accepting the challenge. David looked round him in amazement, and his cheeks burned with shame. What were the people doing to allow this boasting heathen Philistine to defy the armies of the living God? Eagerly he turned to the men around him and began to ask them what it meant. The soldiers answered him shortly. No, there was no one who dared to go forth and fight Goliath. The king had promised great rewards to any man who would kill the giant, but no one had dared to try. David's elder brothers heard his questions, and seeing how amazed he was, they began to grow angry. Did he mean to reproach them? Perhaps he thought of offering himself to fight the champion. It was time that the shepherd boy should be put in his proper place. So his eldest brothers turned to him with a sneer. Why camest thou hither, and with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know thy pride, and thy naughtiness of thy heart, for thou hast come down that thou mightest see the battle. It could not have been very easy to bear this taunt, but David had learned to conquer himself before he set out to conquer giants. So he answered quietly instead of flashing back an angry reply. What have I done? He asked. May I not ask a harmless question? There were many questions he still wished to ask, and presently the soldiers began to repeat his words one to another, until at last the report was spread that someone had been found ready and willing to answer the challenge of a giant Philistine. And of course the news soon reached the king's ear. Saul sent immediately and ordered that the shepherd lad should be brought to him. He had quite forgotten about the boy who had charmed away his black moods with the magic music of his harp, and David had grown and changed since those days. So now, when David stood before the king, Saul had no idea who he was, and his one thought, as he looked at the slender youth, was that it was madness to think of such a mere boy going out to give battle to the great giant. Thou art not able to go against this Philistine, he said, for thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. But David answered eagerly. He did not boast, but spoke steadily and wisely. True, he had not been trained as a soldier, but his courage and his strength had both been already proved. And he went on to tell the king that while he kept his father's sheep, he had often to defend them from wild beasts. Once he had fought with a lion and a bear single-handed and had killed them both. It was not in his own strength that he trusted. The Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine, he ended triumphantly. Faith in God was David's sure defense, and Saul, as he listened, bowed his head in shame, for it was the faith which he himself had lost. It was this faith, he knew, which might win the victory. It was an echo of the confidence he had once felt when his whole trust had been in God, and he recognized the true ring of the boy's courage. Go, he said, and the Lord be with thee. Then the king was eager to put his own armor on David, and he bade the soldiers arm him with a royal sword and put a brass helmet on his head. But David was not accustomed to wear heavy armor, and had never been trained to use a sword. No, he would do his best with the only weapon he thoroughly understood. So putting on once more his shepherd's coat, he took his sling in his hand, and as he crossed the brook at the foot of the valley, he filled his shepherd's bag with smooth stones and fitted one of them to his sling. Then with springing steps he began to climb the opposite side. The rage of Goliath was great when he saw the slender, fair-haired boy, without either armor or sword, coming so boldly to meet him. Am I a dog, he shouted, that thou comest to me with staves? I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied, rang out the clear answer. The Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. The great giant lifted his spear ready with one blow to end this unequal fight, but David did not wait to come within reach of the spear. Before Goliath came near, the boy stopped suddenly and sent a stone whizzing through the air straight at the giant's head. The stone sank into Goliath's forehead, and the great figure reeled and fell with a mighty crash to the earth. Instantly David seized his sword and cut off his head. So God's people were saved, and so again God made use of the shepherd boy's training and skill, this time to win a great victory for his people. The fair-haired shepherd boy had done his duty faithfully in the fields on the hillside at home, where he was but little thought of. He had always tried to do his best, whether he was keeping the sheep or practicing with his sling or learning to play the harp. And now suddenly the great opportunity had come and found him ready. He had entered the camp an unnoticed country lad, carrying provisions to his brothers. Now every soldier in the camp was shouting his name. The king was ready to shower rewards and honors upon him. He was the hero of the hour. The pleasant days in the Bethlehem fields were now over for David. There was no thought of allowing him to return to his work. No, the king declared he must remain as a soldier in the army, ready to defend his king and country. Though he was still a mere boy, he was placed in command and set over the men of war. It was much more difficult work than looking after sheep, and as time went on and dangers and difficulties beset him on every side, David must often have longed for the old quiet days on the hillside. His path was rough and dangerous now, and sad to say, his feet often slipped and he wandered far astray, but always he held fast to his faith in God and found his way back to the straight path. As the years went by, Samuel's promise was at last fulfilled, and David was made king over God's chosen people. David had often forgotten God, but God had never forgotten him. What a change it was from the days when he wandered about the fields in his sheepskin coat, often sleeping out under the stars, possessing only his harp and his shepherd's sling. Now he wore royal robes, and there was a crown of pure gold upon his head. Instead of the starry sky for a roof, he now lived in a palace of cedar wood. And he knew surely that it was God who had taken care of him, that it was God who had set the crown of gold upon his head, the seal to the promise made in that long ago day, when the old prophet had poured the anointing oil upon the head of the wandering shepherd boy. Looking back, he saw that he had made many mistakes, that his soul was stained with many sins. But he knew, too, that God would listen when he prayed, "Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow." As a little shepherd lad, he had cared far more for his sheep than his own safety. He had always been ready to risk his life for them. So now, when he became king, his people were just as precious to him as his sheep had been. He cared for them with all his heart. He was prepared to suffer himself rather than any hurt should come near them. So perhaps he was, after all, not unworthy to stand as a type of the great king, great David's greater son, the little baby who was to be born in the town of Bethlehem, the good shepherd who was to lay down his life for his sheep. End of David the Shepherd Boy by Amy Steedman. Read by Renee Lacroix, Woodstock, Ontario, Canada.
The Rainbow Maker by Miss W. K. Clifford. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Etel. The children stood under an archway. Behind them was the blue sky. In front of them the clear, still lake that wandered and wound about the garden. Above their heads the leaves of a tree whispered and told strange stories to the breeze. Poor tree, it's sighing for the blossoms the wind has carried away, they said to each other, and they looked back at the garden. And poor flowers too, they said. All your bright colors are gone, and your petals lie scattered on the ground. Tomorrow they will be dead. Ah, no, the flowers sighed. The Rainbow Maker will gather them up, and once more they will see the sun. Before the children could answer, a tall fair maiden came down the pathway. They could see her plainly in the twilight. Her eyes were dim with gathering tears, but on her lips there was a smile that came and went and flickered round her mouth. All down her back hung her pale golden hair. Round her neck was a kerchief of many colors. Her dress was soft and white, and her snowy apron was gathered up in one hand. She looked neither to the right nor to the left. She did not utter a single word, and the children could hear no sound of her footstep, no rustling from her dress. She stopped, and picking up the fading petals, looked at them tenderly for a moment, while the tears fell slowly down her cheeks, but the smile hovered around her mouth, for she knew that they would shine again in the sight of their beloved son. When her apron was quite full, she turned round and left the garden. Hand in hand the children followed. She went slowly on by the side of the lake, far, far away across the meadows and up the farthest hill, until at last she found her home behind a cloud just opposite the sun. There she sat all through the summer days making rainbows. When the children had watched her for a long, long time, they went softly back to their own home. The rainbow maker had not even seen them. "Mother," they said one day, "we know now where the colors go from the flowers. See, they are there." And as they spoke they thought of the maiden sitting silent at work in her cloud home. They knew that she was weeping at sending forth her most beautiful one, and yet smiling as she watched the soft archway she had made. "See, they are all there, dear mother," the children repeated, looking at the falling rain and the shining sun, and pointing to the rainbow that spanned the river. End of The Rainbow Maker by Miss W. K. Clifford.
The Donkey, the Table, and the Stick, from the Oak Tree Fairy Book, Favorite Fairy Tales, edited by Clifton Johnson. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Donkey, the Table, and the Stick. There was once a poor tailor who had a son named Jack, and they two were all there was to the family, unless we count the goat that gave them the milk they had to drink. They took very good care of the goat, and Jack led her every day down to the riverside, where the grass grew greenest, that she might have plenty to eat. In the evening Jack would go down to the river to fetch the goat home. "Well, goat," he would say, "have you had enough?" And the goat would reply, "I am so full I cannot pull another blade of grass. Baa, baa." "Then come along," Jack would say, and he would tie a cord to the goat's neck and lead her home to her stall and fasten her up. Afterward he would tell his father that he had brought the goat home, and his father would ask, "Has the goat had plenty to eat today?" "Oh, yes," Jack would answer, "she is so full she no more can pull." But one evening the tailor was looking at the goat, and he thought she seemed rather thin, and he said, "My dear goat, are you full?" And the goat replied, "How can I be full? There was nothing to pull, though I looked all about me. Ba, ba." "What is this I hear?" cried the tailor angrily, for he had a hasty temper. "My son has been deceiving me then." He went to the house and found Jack. "You said the goat was full," he shouted, "and she has been hungry all the time." The tailor was so enraged that Jack was afraid he was going to beat him, and the lad hurried out of the house and down the road as fast as he could go. "The farther I get the better," said he, "for it shall be a good while before I shall dare show my face at home again." So the next day there was no Jack to take the goat to the feeding place by the waterside, and the tailor had to lead her there himself. The food was plentiful, and he said to her, "Now for once you can eat to your heart's content." Then he went back to his work, and in the evening he came to get the goat, and he said to her, "Well, goat, are you full?" And the goat answered, "I am so full I could not pull another blade of grass. Ba, ba." "Come home then,"
said the tailor, and he led her to the stall and fastened her up. "You are full this time," he said as he was leaving her, but the goat said, "How can I be full? There was nothing to pull, though I looked all about me. Ba, ba." When the tailor heard that, he knew that the goat was not speaking the truth. "If she lies today," said he, "no doubt she lied yesterday, and I have made a mistake in not believing my son." Then he laid hold of the goat and exclaimed, "Wait a minute, you ungrateful beast! I will give you a beating that you will long remember." He picked up a stout stick, dragged the goat from her stall, and belaboured her very heartily until she broke away from him and ran off. Week after week passed, and the tailor felt very sad. He was all alone, and there was not a day that he did not wish his son would return home, but no one knew where Jack had gone. Now what had happened to Jack was this. He ran and he ran until he ran right up against a little old woman who was walking along the road. "Whither so fast, my lad?" she asked. "I beg your pardon," replied Jack. "I have left home to go out in the wide world and seek my fortune, and I was in a hurry." "Why not apprentice yourself to my husband then?" said the old woman. "He is a miller, and he needs a helper, and I can promise you that he will pay good wages." Jack promptly agreed to accept the work offered, for he was very hungry and tired. So the old woman took Jack to the mill, and he served the miller for a year and a day. Then the miller told Jack he would pay him his wages. "You have behaved very well," said he, "and I'm going to give you a donkey, but this donkey will draw no cart and carry no sack." "What is the good of him then?" asked Jack. "He spits out gold and silver," replied the miller. "You have but to pull one of his ears, and he will begin at once to hee-haw, hee-haw, and when he brays there will drop from his mouth silver sixpences and half-crowns and golden guineas." "Very good," said the lad, and he thanked the miller and set forth, leading the donkey behind him. "I shall have no cares now," said Jack. "My purse will always be full, and wherever I go I shall live on the best." By and by he stopped at an inn, and the landlord was for taking the donkey from him to tie him up, but Jack said, "Oh no, you need not trouble to do that. I will go to the stable with him myself, and then I shall know where to find him." So the young apprentice took his donkey to the stable, and afterward went into the inn and ordered as good a supper as the landlord could provide. The innkeeper stared, for he did not think that a man who took care of his own donkey could have much to spend, and he refused to serve him without being paid beforehand. "You need not worry," said Jack. "I can get plenty of money." And he went off to the stable, pulled one of the donkey's ears, and got a pocketful of gold and silver. The landlord wondered what Jack meant by saying he could get plenty of money. "I will follow the lad and see where he keeps his wealth," he said. So the landlord slipped after Jack and saw everything he did through a crack in the stable door. "Dear me," said he, "that is an easy way of getting ducats. A purse of money such as that donkey seems to be is no bad thing." After Jack had eaten supper and gone to bed, the landlord visited the stable again, and this time he led the gold donkey away and tied another in his place. The next morning, early, the apprentice went to the stable and got the donkey, never doubting that he had the right one. "I will go back to my father now," said he. "His anger must have cooled long ago, and when he knows I have this gold donkey, he will receive me kindly." By noon he came to his father's house, and his father was rejoiced to see him. "What trade have you taken up, my son?" said he, after the first greetings were over with. "I am a miller, dear father," answered Jack. "And what have you brought home with you to show for your year's work?" asked the father. "I have brought home a donkey," said Jack, "that furnishes me with more money than I know what to do with. Why, with that donkey I can make you rich with no trouble at all." "That is very fine," said the tailor. "I am getting old, and it is irksome work snipping and sewing so unceasingly. I have long wanted to quit it. I suppose now I need not labor with my needle any more." "No," replied Jack. "Throw your needle away, and call in the neighbors. I will make them rich too." So the tailor rushed out and went from house to house telling all the people of the village the good news. Soon they came flocking back with him, and then Jack made them a speech as they stood round about the house, and after that he led his donkey into the midst of the crowd and began pulling the beast's ears. But, though Jack pulled and pulled, and the donkey hee-hawed and hee-hawed, no silver or gold was forthcoming. The crowd laughed, and the tailor was so angry at Jack that the young man thought his father was going to thrash him, and he took to his heels. He ran and ran till he came bang against a door and burst it open, and there he was in a carpenter's shop. "You seem to be in great haste," said the carpenter. "Yes," replied Jack, "but I will go no farther if you will give me work." "All right," the carpenter responded. "Be my apprentice, and I will pay you well." Jack agreed, and he served the carpenter for a year and a day. Then the master said, "I will now give you your wages. I will let you have 10 shillings in money, which will very likely come handy, and you may take this little table. When you are hungry, you have only to say, 'Table, be covered,' and at once it will have a clean cloth on it, and dishes, and lots to eat and drink." The young apprentice thought he was set up for life, and he put the 10 shillings in his pocket and took the table on his back, and went merrily on his way. At length he came to the inn where he had stopped the year before. It was full of guests, but they bade Jack welcome, and asked him to sit down with them to eat, as otherwise he might not be able to get anything. "You are very kind," said Jack, "yet I am not so badly off as you think, and instead of accepting your invitation, I will ask you all to share with me a feast of my own providing." Then they laughed, for they thought he was joking. But he brought in his little wooden table and said, "Table, be covered." Without delay the table was set with much better food than the landlord had been able to give his guests, and the odor of it greeted their noses very agreeably. "Fall to, my good friends," said Jack, and the guests, when they understood how things were, needed no second asking. They went at the food most valiantly, and as often as a dish was emptied, a full one took its place. All the while the landlord stood in a corner watching proceedings with keen interest. "Such cooking as that would make my inn prosper," said he to himself. When at last the party broke up, Jack left his wishing table standing against the wall and went to bed. The landlord locked up and went to bed also, but he could not sleep for thinking of Jack's table. He remembered that he had in his attic an old table very like it, and finally he got up and fetched that table down and exchanged it for Jack's. Jack, none the wiser, rose the next day early, paid his reckoning, took the worthless table on his back, and set off to see his father. He never once stopped by the way, not even for breakfast, and by 9 o'clock he reached his father's house. The tailor was rejoiced to see his son, and asked him what he had been doing all the long year that he had been gone. "Oh," said Jack, "I have learned to be a carpenter." "That is a good trade," said the tailor, "and what have you brought back with you?" "I have brought this little table," Jack responded. The tailor looked at it on all sides. "Rather a rubbishing old table, I call it," said he. "But it is a very wonderful one," explained Jack. "I can ask that table for anything I please in the line of food and drink, and it furnishes what I call for in no time. Let us invite the neighbors to come, and we will all feast and enjoy ourselves." So the tailor hastened to get the neighbors together, and then Jack put his table in their midst and said, "Table, be covered." But nothing came of his command, and the table remained just as empty as any other table that does not understand talking. Jack felt very foolish then, and the company joked him freely, and his father began to upbraid him, and grow more and more wrathful, and the young man was frightened and had no doubt his father was about to chastise him with his cane. So he got away as fast as his legs would carry him, and he ran and ran until he tumbled into a river. A man who happened to be near by pulled him out and said, "I suppose you are not looking for work, or you would not be going so fast." "No," said Jack, "I was not looking for anything, but I want work nevertheless." "Well," said the man, "I have a turning shop here on the river bank, and I will take you for an apprentice and pay you well." So Jack worked for the turner a year and a day, and then his master, to reward him for his labor and his good conduct, handed him a few shillings in money, and after that gave him a sack and told him there was a stick inside of it. "The sack may be of use to me," said Jack, "but what is the good of the stick?" "I will tell you," said the master. "If any man does you harm, and you say, 'Out stick, and bang him,' the stick will jump out and drub him soundly, and will not stop until you say, 'Stick into the sack.'" The apprentice thanked his master and started on his travels, and he was not long in seeking the inn where he had formerly fared so badly. He ate supper, and as he was sitting by the inn-room fire afterward, the landlord asked, "What is it you have in that sack which you take such care of?" "Well," replied Jack, "I don't propose to tell you, but I'll say this, I wouldn't exchange what I have in that bag for 1,000 guineas." That roused the landlord's curiosity more than ever. "What in the world can it be?" thought he. "Perhaps he has a lot of precious stones in his sack." By and by Jack nodded off into a nap, and as no one else was present, the landlord laid hold of the sack, and was taking it away when Jack awoke. "Out stick and bang him!" he cried. At once the stick flew from the bag and battered the innkeeper on the back, rapped his head and bruised his arms and legs until he fell groaning to the floor. "Have mercy, have mercy," begged the landlord. "I will have mercy when you give me my table and donkey," said Jack. "You can have anything you want," said the wretched man, "if only you will make this terrible goblin stick stop beating me." "Very well," was Jack's response, and then he said, "Stick, into the sack." At once the stick left the man in peace and disappeared into the bag, and the landlord told Jack where he kept the table and the donkey, and promised he should have them whenever he chose to take them. Then he crept off to bed very lame and sore. The next morning the landlord turned over to Jack the gold donkey and the wishing table, and the young man set out for his father's house. He arrived an hour before noon, and the tailor was very glad to see him again, and asked what he had learned while he had been away. "My dear father," answered Jack, "I have been apprenticed to a turner." "A very ingenious handicraft," said the father, "and what have you brought back with you?" "A stick in a sack," Jack replied. "What!" cried the old tailor, "a stick in a sack! Have you gone crazy?" "But it is not a common stick," Jack explained. "When any man means to harm me, I simply say, 'Out stick and bang him,' and the stick jumps from the sack and gives the fellow such a pounding that he is soon glad to beg my pardon. You remember last year I told you about a wishing table that supplied me with food, and the year before I told you about a donkey that furnished me with money? Well, the table and donkey were stolen from me by a wicked innkeeper, but with this stick I have recovered them both. Now let the neighbors all be sent for, and they shall have the finest feast they have ever had in their lives, and I will fill their pockets with gold." So the old tailor called the neighbors together, and the son took his little table and said, "Table, be covered," and at once it was set with a feast that kept the company jolly for a long time. After that Jack brought the donkey and pulled his ears, and the money jingled out of his mouth until they all had as much as they could carry away, and I cannot help thinking it a great pity that you and I were not there. The next day the tailor took his needles and thread, his yard measure and his goose, and locked them up in a cupboard, and he lived ever after with his son in great ease and luxury. But what became of the goat, the unlucky cause of Jack's being driven from home? I will tell you. She ran to the woods and into a fox's hole and hid herself. When the fox came home he caught sight of two great eyes staring at him out of the darkness, and the fox was so frightened that he scampered away as fast as he could go until he met a bear. "Hold on, Brother Fox," called the bear. "What is the trouble that you should be racing off like that?" "Oh dear," answered the fox, "a grisly beast is sitting in my hole, and he stared at me with such fiery eyes." "I will soon drive him out," said the bear. So he went to the fox's hole and looked in, but when he caught sight of the goat's gleaming eyes, he too was terrified, and fled in great haste until he met a bee. "Stop, Brother Bear, stop!" called the bee. "What has happened? I never knew you to get over the ground so fast before, and you have a very depressed countenance. What has become of your high spirit?" "Well, you may ask," the bear replied. "In the fox's hole there sits a grisly beast with fiery eyes, and neither the fox nor I can drive him out." "I am a poor feeble little creature," said the bee, "and I know you despise me, Bear, but I think I can help you." So the bee flew into the fox's hole and stung the goat on the head. Then the goat jumped and cried, "Baa, baa," and ran out like mad into the world, and whither she went no one knows to this hour. End of The Donkey, the Table, and the Stick.
The Cat and the Mouse by Joseph Jacobs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. There once was a cat and a mouse. They lived in the same house. The cat bit the mouse's tail off. "Pray, puss," said the mouse, "give me my long tail again." "No," said the cat, "I will not give you your tail till you bring me some milk." First she leapt, and then she ran, till she came to the cow, and thus she began. "Pray, cow, give me some milk for the cat, then she will give me my long tail again." "No," said the cow, "I will give you no milk till you bring me some hay." First she leapt, and then she ran, till she came to the farmer, and thus she began. "Pray, farmer, give me some hay for the cow, then she will give me some milk for the cat, and then the cat will give me my long tail again." "No," said the farmer, "I will give you no hay till you bring me some meat." First she leapt, and then she ran, till she came to the butcher, and thus she began. "Pray, butcher, give me some meat for the farmer, then he will give me some hay for the cow will give me some milk for the cat, and then the cat will give me my long tail again." "No," said the butcher, "I will give you no meat till you bring me some bread." First she leapt, and then she ran, till she came to the baker, and thus she began. "Pray, baker, give me some bread for the butcher, then he will give me some meat for the farmer will give me some hay for the cow will give me some milk for the cat, and then the cat will give me my long tail again." "Yes," said the baker, "I will give you some bread, but if you eat my flour, I will cut off your head." The baker gave the mouse some bread, and she took it to the butcher. The butcher gave the mouse some meat, and she took it to the farmer. The farmer gave the mouse some hay, and she took it to the cow. The cow gave the mouse some milk, and she took it to the cat. And then the cat gave the mouse her long tail again. End of The Mouse and the Cat by Joseph Jacobs.
The Tale of Peter Rabbit by Beatrix Potter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Once upon a time, there were 4 little rabbits, and their names were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. They lived with their mother in a sandbank underneath the root of a very big fir tree. "Now, my dears," said old Mrs. Rabbit one morning, "you may go into the fields or down the lane, but don't go into Mr. McGregor's garden. Your father had an accident there. He was put in a pie by Mrs. McGregor. Now run along and don't get into mischief. I'm going out." Then old Mrs. Rabbit took a basket and her umbrella to the baker's. She bought a loaf of brown bread and 5 currant buns. Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail, who were good little bunnies, went down the lane to gather blackberries. But Peter, who was very naughty, ran straight away to Mr. McGregor's garden and squeezed under the gate. First, he ate some lettuces and some French beans, and then he ate some radishes. And then, feeling rather sick, he went to look for some parsley. But round the end of a cucumber frame, whom should he meet but Mr. McGregor? Mr. McGregor was on his hands and knees planting out young cabbages, but he jumped up and ran after Peter, waving a rake and calling out, "Stop, thief!" Peter was most dreadfully frightened. He rushed all over the garden, for he had forgotten the way back to the gate. He lost one of his shoes among the cabbages, and the other shoe amongst the potatoes. After losing them, he ran on 4 legs and went faster, so that I think he might have got away altogether if he had not, unfortunately, run into a gooseberry net, and got caught by the large buttons on his jacket. It was a blue jacket with brass buttons, quite new. Peter gave himself up for lost and shed big tears, but his sobs were overheard by some friendly sparrows, who flew to him in great excitement and implored him to exert himself. Mr. McGregor came up with a sieve, which he intended to pop upon the top of Peter, but Peter wriggled out just in time, leaving his jacket behind him, and rushed into the tool shed and jumped into a can. It would have been a beautiful thing to hide in if it had not had so much water in it. Mr. McGregor was quite sure that Peter was somewhere in the tool shed, perhaps hidden underneath a flower pot. He began to turn them over carefully, looking under each. Presently, Peter sneezed. "Kertissue!" Mr. McGregor was after him in no time, and tried to put his foot upon Peter, who jumped out of a window, upsetting 3 plants. The window was too small for Mr. McGregor, and he was tired of running after Peter. He went back to his work. Peter sat down to rest. He was out of breath and trembling with fright, and he had not the least idea which way to go. Also, he was very damp with sitting in that can. After a time, he began to wander about, going lippity-lippity, not very fast, and looking all around. He found a door in a wall, but it was locked, and there was no room for a fat little rabbit to squeeze underneath. An old mouse was running in and out of the stone's doorstep, carrying peas and beans to her family in the wood. Peter asked her the way to the gate, but she had such a large pea in her mouth that she could not answer. She only shook her head at him. Peter began to cry. Then he tried to find his way straight across the garden, but he became more and more puzzled. Presently he came to a pond where Mr. McGregor filled his water cans. A white cat was staring at some goldfish. He sat very, very still, but now and then the tip of his tail twitched as if it were alive. Peter thought it best to go away without speaking to her. He had heard about cats from his cousin, little Benjamin Bunny. He went back towards the tool shed, but suddenly, quite close to him, he heard the noise of a horsh, scratch, scratch, scratch. Peter scuttered underneath the bushes, but presently, as nothing happened, he came out and climbed upon a wheelbarrow and peeped over. The first thing he saw was Mr. McGregor hoeing onions. His back was turned towards Peter, and beyond him was the gate. Peter got very quietly off the wheelbarrow and started running as fast as he could along a straight walk behind some blackcurrant bushes. Mr. McGregor caught sight of him at the corner, but Peter did not care. He slipped underneath the gate, was safe at last in the wood outside the garden. Mr. McGregor hung up the little jacket and the shoes for a scarecrow to frighten the blackbirds. Peter never stopped running or looked behind him till he got home to the big fir tree. He was so tired that he flopped down upon the nice soft sand on the floor of the rabbit hole and shut his eyes. His mother was busy cooking. She wondered what he had done with his clothes. It was the second little jacket and pair of shoes that Peter had lost in a fortnight. I'm sorry to say that Peter was not very well during the evening. His mother put him to bed and made some chamomile tea, and she gave a dose of it to Peter. 1 tablespoon to be taken at bedtime. But Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail had bread and milk and blackberries for supper. The end of The Tale of Peter Rabbit by Beatrix Potter.
The Tale of Samuel Whiskers by Beatrix Potter. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. The Tale of Samuel Whiskers by Beatrix Potter. Read by Frances Brown. Once upon a time, there was an old cat called Mrs. Tabitha Twitchit, who was an anxious parent. She used to lose her kittens continually, and whenever they were lost, they were always in mischief. On baking day, she determined to shut them up in a cupboard. She caught Moppet and Mittens, but she could not find Tom. Mrs. Tabitha went up and down all over the house, mewing for Tom Kitten. She looked in the pantry, under the staircase, and searched the best spare room that was all covered up with dust sheets. She went right upstairs and looked into the attics, but she could not find him anywhere. It was an old, old house, full of cupboards and passages. Some of the walls were 4 feet thick, and there used to be queer noises inside them, as if there might be a little secret staircase. Certainly there were odd little jagged doorways in the wainscot, and things disappeared at night, especially cheese and bacon. Mrs. Tabitha became more and more distracted and mewed dreadfully. While their mother was searching the house, Moppet and Mittens had got into mischief. The cupboard door was not locked, so they pushed it open and came out. They went straight to the dough which was set to rise in a pan before the fire. They patted it with their little soft paws. "Shall we make our dear muffins?" said Mittens to Moppet. But just at that moment somebody knocked at the door, and Moppet jumped into the flour barrel in a fright. Mittens ran away to the dairy and hid in an empty jar on the stone shelf where the milk pans stand. The visitor was a neighbor, Mrs. Ribby. She had called to borrow some yeast. Mrs. Tabitha came downstairs mewing dreadfully. "Come in, Cousin Ribby, come in and sit ye down. I'm in sad trouble, Cousin Ribby," said Tabitha, shedding tears. "I've lost my dear son Thomas. I'm afraid the rats have got him." She wiped her eyes with her apron. "He's a bad kitten, Cousin Tabitha. He's made a cat's cradle of my best bonnet last time I came to tea. Where have you looked for him?" "All over the house. The rats are too many for me. What a thing it is to have an unruly family," said Mrs. Tabitha Twitchit. "I'm not afraid of rats. I will help you find him, and whip him too. What is all that soot in the fender?" "The chimney wants sweeping. Oh, dear me, Cousin Ribby. Now Moppet and Mittens are gone. They've both got out of the cupboard." Ribby and Tabitha set to work to search the house thoroughly again. They poked under the beds with Ribby's umbrella, and they rummaged in the cupboards. They even fetched a candle and looked inside the clothes chest in one of the attics. They could not find anything, but once they heard a door bang and somebody scuttered downstairs. "Yes, it is infested with rats," said Tabitha tearfully. "I caught 7 young ones out of the hole in the back kitchen, and we had them for dinner last Saturday. And once I saw the old father rat, an enormous rat, Cousin Ribby, and I was going to jump on him when he showed his yellow teeth at me and whisked down the hole." "The rats get upon my nerves, Cousin Ribby," said Tabitha. Ribby and Tabitha searched and searched. They both heard a curious roly-poly noise under the attic floor, but there was nothing to be seen. They returned to the kitchen. "Here's one of your kittens, at least," said Ribby, dragging Moppet out of the flour barrel. They shook the flour off her and sent her down the kitchen floor. She seemed to be in a terrible fright. "Oh, Mother, Mother," said Moppet, "there's been an old woman rat in the kitchen, and she's stolen some of the dough." The 2 cats ran to look at the dough pan. Sure enough, There were marks of little scratching fingers, and a lump of dough was gone. "Which way did she go, Moppet?" But Moppet had been too much frightened to peep out of the barrel again. Ribby and Tabitha took her with them to keep her safely in sight, while they went on with their search. They went into the dairy. The first thing they found was Mittens, hiding in an empty jar. They tipped up the jar, and she scrambled out. "Oh, Mother, Mother," said Mittens. "Oh, Mother, Mother, there has been an old man rat in the dairy, a dreadful, enormous big rat, Mother, and he's stolen a pat of butter and the rolling pin." Ribby and Tabitha looked at one another. "A rolling pin and butter! Oh, my poor son Thomas!" exclaimed Tabitha, wringing her paws. "A rolling pin?" said Ribby. "Did we not hear a roly-poly noise in the attic when we were looking into that chest?" Ribby and Tabitha rushed upstairs again. Sure enough, the roly-poly noise was still going on. "This is serious, Cousin Tabitha," said Ribby. "We must send for John Joyner at once, with a saw." Now, this is what had been happening to Tom Kitten, and it shows how very unwise it is to go up a chimney in a very old house, where a person does not know his way, and where there are enormous rats. Tom Kitten did not want to be shut up in a cupboard. When he saw that his mother was going to bake, he determined to hide. He looked about for a nice convenient place, and fixed upon the chimney. The fire had only just been lighted, and it was not hot, but there was a white choky smoke from the green sticks. Tom Kitten had gotten upon the fender and looked up. It was a big, old-fashioned fireplace. The chimney itself was wide enough inside for a man to stand up and walk about, so there was plenty of room for a little tomcat. He jumped right up in the fireplace, balancing himself upon the iron bar where the kettle hangs. Tom Kitten took another big jump off the bar and landed on a ledge high up inside the chimney, knocking down some soot into the fender. Tom Kitten coughed and choked with the smoke, and he could hear the sticks beginning to crackle and burn in the fireplace down below. He made up his mind to climb right to the top and get out on the slates and try to catch sparrows. "I can't go back. If I slipped, I might fall into the fire and singe my beautiful tail and my little blue jacket." The chimney was a very big old-fashioned one. It was built in the days when people burnt logs of wood upon the hearth. The chimney stack stood up above the roof, like a little stone tower, and the daylight shone down from the top under the slanting slates that kept out the rain. Tom Kitten was getting very frightened. He climbed up and up and up. Then he waded sideways through inches of soot. He was like a little sweep himself. It was most confusing in the dark. One flue seemed to lead into another. There was less smoke, but Tom Kitten felt quite lost. He scrambled up and up, but before he reached the chimney top, he came to a place where somebody had loosened a stone in the wall. There were some mutton bones lying about. "This seems funny," said Tom Kitten. "Who has been gnawing bones up here in the chimney? I wish I had never come. And what a funny smell. It is something like a mouse, only dreadfully strong. It makes me sneeze," said Tom Kitten. He squeezed through the hole in the wall and dragged himself along a most uncomfortably tight passage where there was scarcely any light. He groped his way carefully for several yards. He was at the back of the skirting board in the attic, where there is a little mark in the picture. All at once he fell head over heels in the dark down a hole and landed on a heap of very dirty rags. When Tom Kitten picked himself up and looked about him, he found himself in a place that he had never seen before, although he had lived his whole life in the house. It was a very small, stuffy, fusty room, with boards and rafters and cobwebs and lath and plaster. Opposite to him, as far away as he could sit, was an enormous rat. "What do you mean by tumbling into my bed all covered with smuts?" said the rat, chattering his teeth. "Please, sir, the chimney wants sweeping," said poor Tom Kitten. "Anna Maria, Anna Maria," squeaked the rat. There was a pattering noise, and an old woman rat poked her head around a rafter. All in a minute she rushed upon Tom Kitten, and before he knew what was happening, his coat was pulled off, he was rolled into a bundle, and tied with a string in a very hard knots. Anna Maria did the tying. The old rat watched her and took snuff. When she had finished, they both sat staring at him with their mouths open. "Anna Maria," said the old man rat, whose name was Samuel Whiskers, "Anna Maria, make me a kitten dumpling roly-poly pudding for my dinner." "It requires dough and a pat of butter and a rolling pin," said Anna Maria, considering Tom Kitten, with her head on one side. "No," said Samuel Whiskers, "make it properly, Anna Maria, with breadcrumbs." "Nonsense! Butter and dough," replied Anna Maria. The two rats consulted together for a few minutes and then went away. Samuel Whiskers got through a hole in the wainscot and went boldly down the front staircase to the dairy to get the butter. He did not meet anybody. He made a second journey for the rolling pin. He pushed it in front of him with his paws, like a brewer's man trundling a barrel. He could hear Ribby and Tabitha talking, but they were busy lighting the candle to look into the chest. They did not see him. Anna Maria went down by way of the skirting board and a window shutter to the kitchen to steal the dough. She borrowed a small saucer and scooped up the dough with her paws. She did not observe Moppet. While Tom Kitten was left alone under the floor of the attic, he wriggled about her, trying to mew for help. But his mouth was full of soot and cobwebs, and he was tied up in such very tight knots, he could not make anybody hear him, except a spider, which came out from a crack in the ceiling and examined the knots critically from a safe distance. It was a judge of knots because it had a habit of tying up unfortunate blue bottles. It did not offer to assist him. Tom Kitten wriggled and squirmed until he was quite exhausted. Presently the rats came back and set to work to make him into a dumpling. First they smeared him with butter, and then they rolled him into dough. "Will not the string be very indigestible, Anna Maria?" inquired Samuel Whiskers. Anna Maria said she thought that it was of no consequence, but she wished that Tom Kitten would hold his head still as it disarranged the pastry. She laid hold of his ears. Tom Kitten bit and spat and mewed and wriggled, and the rolling pin went roly-poly, roly-roly, poly-roly. The rats each held an end. "His tail is sticking out. You did not fetch enough dough, Anna Maria." "I fetched as much as I could." "I do not think," said Samuel Whiskers, pausing to take a look at Tom Kitten, "I do not think it will be a good pudding. It smells sooty." Anna Maria was about to argue the point, when all at once there began to be other sounds above, the rasping noise of a saw, and the noise of a little dog scratching and yelping. The rats dropped the rolling pin and listened attentively. "We are discovered and interrupted, Anna Maria. Let us collect our property, and other people's, and depart at once. I fear that we shall be obliged to leave this pudding, but I am persuaded that the knots would have provided indigestible, whatever you may urge to the contrary. Come away at once and help me to tie up some mutton bones and a counterpane," said Anna Maria. "I have got half a smoked ham hidden in the chimney." So it happened that by the time John Joiner had gotten the plank up, there was nobody under the floor except the rolling pin and Tom Kitten in a very dirty dumpling. But there was a strong smell of rats, and John Joiner spent the rest of the morning sniffing and whining and wagging his tail, and going round and round with his head in the hole like a gimlet. And then he nailed the plank down again and put his tools in the bag and came downstairs. The cat family had quite recovered. They invited him to stay to dinner. The dumpling had been peeled off Tom Kitten and made separately into a bag of pudding with currants in it to hide the smuts. They had been obliged to put Tom Kitten in a hot bath to get the butter off. John Joiner smelt the pudding, but he regretted that he had not time to stay for dinner, because he had just finished making a wheelbarrow for Mrs. Potter, and she had ordered 2 hen coops. And when I was going to the post late in the afternoon, I looked up on the lane from the corner, and I saw Mr. Samuel Whiskers and his wife on the run, with big bundles on a little wheelbarrow, which looked very like mine. They were turning in a gate to the barn of Farmer Potatoes. Samuel Whiskers was puffing and out of breath. Anna Maria was still arguing in shrill tones. She seemed to know her way, and she seemed to have a quantity of luggage. I am sure I never gave her leave to borrow my wheelbarrow. They went into the barn and hauled their parcels with a bit of string to the top of the haymow. After that, there were no more rats for a long time at Tabitha Twitchit's. As for Farmer Potatoes, he has been driven nearly distracted. There are rats and rats and rats in his barn. They eat up the chicken food and steal the oats and bran and make holes in all the meal bags. And they are all descended from Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Whiskers, children and grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren. There is no end to them. Moppet and Mittens have grown up into very good rat catchers. They go out rat catching in the village, and they will find plenty employment. They charge so much a dozen, and earn their living very comfortably. They hang up the rats' tails in a row on the barn door to show how many they have caught, dozens and dozens of them. But Tom Kitten has always been afraid of a rat. He never just faced anything that is bigger than a mouse. End of The Tale of Samuel Whiskers by Beatrix Potter.
A Wonderful Story by Anonymous. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Wonderful Story. Once there lived two wrestlers, who were both very, very strong. The stronger of the two had a daughter called Ajit. The other had no daughter at all. These wrestlers did not live in the same country, but their two villages were not far apart. One day the wrestler that had no daughter heard of the wrestler that had a daughter, and he determined to go and find him and wrestle with him to see who was the stronger. He went therefore to Ajit's father's country, and when he arrived at his house, he knocked at the door and said, "Is anyone here?" Ajit answered, "Yes, I am here," and she came out. "Where is the wrestler who lives in this house?" he asked. "My father," answered Ajit, "has taken 300 carts to the jungle, and he is drawing them himself, as he could not get enough bullocks and horses to pull them along. He is gone to get wood." This astonished the wrestler very much. "Your father must indeed be very strong," he said. Then he set off to the jungle, and in the jungle he found 2 dead elephants. He tied them to the 2 ends of a pole, took the pole on his shoulder, and returned to Ajit's house. There he knocked at the door, crying, "Is anyone here?" "Yes, I am here," said Ajit. "Has your father come back?" asked the wrestler. "Not yet," said Ajit, who was busy sweeping the room. Now her father had 12 elephants. 11 were in the stables, but one was lying dead in the room Ajit was sweeping. And as she swept the dead elephant without any trouble out of the door. This frightened the wrestler. "What a strong girl this is," he said to himself. When Ajit had swept all the dust out of the room, she came and gathered it and the dead elephant up and threw the dust and elephant away. The wrestler was more and more astonished. He set off again to find Ajit's father, and met him pulling the 300 carts along. At this he was still more alarmed, but he said to him, "Will you wrestle with me now?" "No," said Ajit's father, "I won't, for here there is no one to see us." The other again begged him to wrestle at once, and at that moment an old woman bent with age came by. She was carrying bread to her son, who had taken his mother's 3,000 or 4,000 camels to browse. The first wrestler called to her at once, "Come and see us wrestle." "No," said the old woman, "for I must take my son his dinner. He is very hungry." "No, no, you must stay and see us wrestle," cried both the wrestlers. "I cannot stay," she said. But do one of you stand on one of my hands and the other on the other, then you can wrestle as we go along." "You carry us," cried the men. "You are so old, you will never be able to carry us." "Indeed I shall," said the old woman. So they got up on her hands, and she rested her hands, with the wrestlers standing on them, on her shoulders, and her son's flour cakes she put on her head. Thus they went on their way, and the men wrestled as they went. Now the old woman had told her son that if he did not do his work well, she would bring men to kill him. So he was dreadfully frightened when he saw his mother coming with the wrestlers. "Here is my mother coming to kill me," he said, and he tied up the 3,000 or 4,000 camels in his cloth, put them all on his head, and ran off with them as fast as he could. "Stop, stop!" cried his mother, when she saw him running away. But he only ran on still faster, and the old woman and the wrestlers ran after him. Just then a kite was flying about, and the kite said to itself, "There must be some meat in that man's cloth." So it swept down and carried off the bundle of camels. The old woman's son at this sat down and cried. The wrestlers soon came up to him and said, "What are you crying for?" "Oh," answered the boy, "my mother said that if I did not do my work, she would bring men to kill me. So, when I saw you coming with her, I tied all the camels up in my cloth, put them on my head, and ran off. A kite came down and carried them all away. That is why I am crying." The wrestlers were much astonished at the boy's strength and at the kite's strength, and they all three set off in the direction in which the kite had flown. Meanwhile, the kite had flown on till it had reached another country, and the daughter of the Rajah of this country was sitting on the roof of the palace, combing her long black hair. The princess looked up at the kite and the bundle and said, "There must be meat in that bundle." At that moment the kite let the bundle of camels fall, and it fell into the princess's eye, and went deep into it. But her eye was so large that it did not hurt her much. "Oh, mother, mother," she cried, "something has fallen into my eye. Come and take it out." Her mother rushed up, took the bundle of camels out of the princess's eye, and shoved the bundle into her pocket. The wrestlers and the old woman's son now came up, having seen all that happened. "Where is the bundle of camels?" said they. "And why do you cry?" they asked the princess. "Oh," said her mother, "she is crying because something fell into her eye." "It was the bundle of camels that fell into her eye, and the bundle is in your pocket," said the old woman's son to the Rani, and he put his hand into her pocket and pulled out the bundle. Then he and the wrestlers went back to Ajit's father's house, and on the way they met his old mother, who went with them. They invited a great many people to dinner, and Ajit took a large quantity of flour and made it into flat cakes. Then she handed a cake to the wrestler who had come to see her father, and gave one to everybody else. "I can't eat such a big cake as this," said the wrestler. "Can't you?" said Ajit. "I can't indeed," he answered. "It is much too big." "Then I will eat it myself," said Ajit. Taking it and all the other cakes, she popped them into her mouth together. "That is not half enough for me," she said. Then she offered him a can of water. "I cannot drink all that water," he said. "Can't you?" said Ajit. "I can drink much more than that." So she filled a large tub with water, lifted it to her mouth, and drank it all up at a draught. The wrestler was very much astonished, and said to her, "Will you come to my house? I will give you a dinner." "You will never be able to give me enough to eat and drink," said Ajit. "Yes, I shall," he said. "You will not be able to give me enough, I am sure," said Ajit. "I cannot come." "Do come," he said. "Very well," she answered. "I will come, but I know you will never be able to give me enough food." So they set off to his house. But when they had gone a little way, she said, "I must have my house with me." "I cannot carry your house," said the wrestler. "You must," said Ajit. "If you don't, I cannot go with you." "But I cannot carry your house," said the wrestler. "Well then," said Ajit, I will carry it myself." So she went back, dug up her house, and hoisted it on her head. This frightened the wrestler. "What a strong woman she must be," he thought. "I will not wrestle with her father, for if I do, he will kill me." Then they all went on till they came to his house. When they got to it, Ajit set her house down on the ground, and the wrestler went to get the dinner he had promised her. He brought quantities of things, all sorts of things, everything he could think of. 3 kinds of flour, milk, dal, rice, curries, and meat. Then he showed them all to Ajit. "That is not enough for my dinner," she said. "Why, that would be hardly enough for my mice." The wrestler wondered very much at this, and asked, "Are your mice so very big?" "Yes, they are very big," she answered. "Come and see." So he took up all the food he had brought, and laid it on the floor of Ajit's house. Then at once all the mice came and ate it up, every bit. The wrestler was greatly surprised, and Ajit said, "Did I not tell you true? And did I not tell you you would never be able to get me enough to eat?" "Come to the Nabha Raja's country," said the wrestler. "There you will surely get enough to eat." To this she agreed. So she, her father, and the wrestler went off to the Nabha Raja's country. "I have brought a very strong girl," said the wrestler to the Nabha Raja. "I will try her strength," said the Raja. "Give me 3 elephants," said Ajit, "and I will carry them for you." Then the Raja sent for 3 elephants and said to her, "Now carry these." "Give me a rope," said Ajit. So they gave her a rope, and she tied the 3 elephants together and flung them over her shoulder. "Now where shall I throw them?" she said to the astonished Raja. "Shall I throw them onto the roof of your palace, or onto the ground, or away out there?" "I don't know," said the Raja. "Throw them upon my roof." She threw the elephants up onto the roof with such force that it broke, and the elephants fell through into the palace. "What have you done?" cried the Raja. "It is not my fault," answered Ajit. "You told me to throw the elephants onto your roof, and so I did." Then the Raja sent for a great many men and bullocks and horses to pull the elephants out of his palace, but they could not the first time they pulled. Then they tried a second time and succeeded, and they threw the elephants away. Then Ajit went home. "What shall I do with this dreadful woman?" said the Nabha Raja. "She is sure to kill me and take all my country. I will try to kill her." So he got his sepoys and guns into order and went out to kill Ajit. She was looking out of her window and saw them coming. "Oh," she said, "here is the Nabha Raja coming to kill me." Then she went out of her house and asked him why he had come. "To kill you," said the Raja. "Is that what you want to do?" she said, and with one hand she took up the Raja, his guns, and his sepoys, and put them all under her arm, and she carried them all off to the Nabha Raja's country. There she put the Raja into prison, and made herself Rani of his kingdom. She was very much pleased at being Rani of the Nabha country, for it was a rich country, and there were quantities of fruits and of corn in it, and she lived happily for a long, long time. End of A Wonderful Story by Anonymous. Read by mlcui.
The Tale of the Pie and the Patty Pan by Beatrix Potter. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recorded by Mary. Pussycat sits by the fire. How should she be fair? In walks the little dog, says, "Pussy, are you there?" "How do you do, Mistress Pussy?" "Mistress Pussy, how do you do?" "I thank you kindly, little dog. I fare as well as you." Old Rhyme. Once upon a time there was a pussy cat called Ribby, who invited a little dog, Duchess, to tea. "Come in good time, my dear Duchess," said Ribby's letter, "and we will have something so very nice." I am baking it in a pie dish with a pink rim. You never tasted anything so good. And you shall eat it all. I will eat muffins, my dear Duchess, wrote Ribby. Duchess read the letter and wrote an answer. I will come with much pleasure at 4:15. But it is very strange. I was just going to invite you to come here to supper, my dear Ribby, to eat something most delicious. I will come very punctually, my dear Ribby, wrote Duchess. And then at the end she added, I hope it isn't mouse. And then she thought that did not look quite polite, so she scratched out isn't mouse and changed it to I hope it will be fine, and she gave her letter to the postman. But she thought a great deal about Ribby's pie, and she read Ribby's letter over and over again. I am dreadfully afraid it will be mouse, said Duchess to herself. I really couldn't eat mouse pie, and I shall have to eat it because it is a party, and my pie was going to be veal and ham, a pink and white pie dish, and so is mine, just like Ribby's dishes. They were both bought at Tabitha Twitch's. Duchess went into her larder and took the pie off a shelf and looked at it. It is all ready to put in the oven. Such lovely pie crust, and I put in a little tin patty pan to hold up the crust, and I made a hole in the middle with a fork to let out the steam. Oh, I do wish I could eat my own pie instead of a pie made of mouse. Duchess considered and read Ribby's letter again. A pink and white pie dish, and you shall eat it all. You means me. Then Ribby is not going to even taste the pie herself? A pink and white pie dish. Ribby is sure to go out to buy the muffins. Oh, what a good idea! Why shouldn't I rush along and put my pie into Ribby's oven when Ribby isn't there? Duchess was quite delighted with her own cleverness. Ribby, in the meantime, had received Duchess's answer, and as soon as she was sure that the little dog could come, she popped her pie into the oven. There were 2 ovens, one above the other. Some other knobs and handles were only ornamental and not intended to open. Ribby put the pie into the lower oven. The door was very stiff. The top oven bakes too quickly, said Ribby to herself. It is a pie of the most delicate and tender mouse, minced up with bacon, and I have taken out all the bones, because Duchess did nearly choke herself with a fish bone last time I gave a party. She eats a little fast, rather big mouthfuls, but a most genteel and elegant little dog, infinitely superior company to Cousin Tabitha Twitchit. Ribby put on some coal and swept up the hearth. Then she went out with a can to the well for water to fill up the kettle. Then she began to set the room in order, for it was the sitting room as well as the kitchen. She shook the mats out at the front door and put them straight. The hearth rug was a rabbit skin. She dusted the clock and the ornaments on the mantelpiece, and she polished and rubbed the table and chairs. Then she spread a very clean white tablecloth and set out her best china tea set, which she took out of a wall cupboard near the fireplace. The teacups were white with a pattern of pink roses, and the dinner plates were white and blue. When Ribby had laid the table, she took a jug and a blue and white dish and went out down the field to the farm to fetch milk and butter. When she came back, she peeped into the bottom oven. The pie looked very comfortable. Ribby put on her shawl and bonnet and went out again with a basket to the village shop to buy a packet of tea, a pound of lump sugar, and a pot of marmalade. And just at the same time, Duchess came out of her house at the other end of the village. Ribby met Duchess halfway down the street, also carrying a basket covered with cloth. They only bowed to one another. They did not speak, because they were going to have a party. As soon as Duchess had got round the corner out of sight, she simply ran straight away to Ribby's house. Ribby went into the shop and bought what she required, and came out after a pleasant gossip with Cousin Tabitha Twitchit. Cousin Tabitha was disdainful afterwards in conversation. A little dog, indeed, just as if there were no cats in Surrey. And a pie for afternoon tea? The very idea, said Cousin Tabitha Twitchit. Ribby went on to Timothy Baker's and bought the muffins. Then she came home. There seemed to be a sort of scuffling noise in the back passage as she was coming in at the front door. I trust that is not that pie. The spoons are locked up, however, said Ribby. But there was nobody there. Ribby opened the bottom oven door with some difficulty and turned the pie. There began to be a pleasing smell of baked mouse. Duchess, in the meantime, had slipped out the back door. It is a very odd thing that Ribby's pie was not in the oven when I put mine in, and I can't find it anywhere. I have looked all over the house. I put my pie into a nice hot oven at the top. I could not turn any of the other handles. I think that they are all shams, said Duchess. But I wish I could have removed the pie made of mouse. I cannot think what she has done with it. I heard Ribby coming, and I had to run out by the back door. Duchess went home and brushed her beautiful black coat, and then she picked a bunch of flowers in her garden as a present for Ribby, and passed the time until the clock struck 4. Ribby, having assured herself by careful search that there was really no one hiding in the cupboard or in the larder, went upstairs to change her dress. She put on a lilac silk gown for the party, and an embroidered muslin apron and tippet. "It is very strange," said Ribby. "I did not think I left that drawer pulled out. Has somebody been trying on my mittens?" She came downstairs again and made the tea, and put the teapot on the hob. She peeped again into the bottom oven. The pie had become a lovely brown, and it was steaming hot. She sat down before the fire to wait for the little dog. "I am glad I used the bottom oven," said Ribby. "The top one would certainly have been very much too hot. I wonder why that cupboard door was open. Can there really have been someone in the house?" Very punctually at 4 o'clock, Duchess started to go to the party. She ran so fast through the village that she was too early, and she had to wait a little while in the lane that leads down to Ribby's house. "I wonder if Ribby has taken my pie out of the oven yet," said Duchess, "and whatever can have become of the other pie made of mouse?" At 4:15 to the minute, there came a most genteel little tap, tappity. "Is Mrs. Ribston at home?" inquired Duchess in the porch. "Come in, and how do you do, my dear Duchess?" cried Ribby. "I hope I see you well?" "Quite well, I thank you. And how do you do, my dear Ribby?" said Duchess. "I've brought you some flowers. What a delicious smell of pie!" "Oh, what lovely flowers! Yes, it is mouse and bacon." "Do not talk about food, my dear Ribby," said Duchess. "What a lovely white tea cloth! Is it done to a turn? Is it still in the oven?" "I think it wants another 5 minutes," said Ribby. "Just a shade longer. I will pour out the tea while we wait. Do you take sugar, my dear Duchess?" "Oh, yes, please, my dear Ribby. And may I have a lump upon my nose?" "With pleasure, my dear Duchess. How beautifully you beg! Oh, how sweetly pretty!" Duchess sat up with the sugar on her nose and sniffed. "How good that pie smells! I do love veal and ham. I mean to say, mouse and bacon." She dropped the sugar in confusion and had to go hunting under the tea table, so did not see which oven Ribby opened in order to get out the pot. Ribby set the pie upon the table. There was a very savory smell. Duchess came out from under the tablecloth munching sugar and sat upon a chair. "I will first cut the pie for you. I'm going to have muffin and marmalade," said Ribby. "Do you really prefer muffin? Mind the patty pan." "I beg your pardon," said Ribby. "May I pass you the marmalade?" said Duchess hurriedly. The pie proved extremely toothsome, and the muffins light and hot. They disappeared rapidly, especially the pie. "I think," thought Duchess to herself, "I think it would be wiser if I had helped myself to pie, though Ribby did not seem to notice anything when she was cutting it. What very small, fine pieces it has cooked into! I did not remember that I had minced it up so fine. I suppose this is a quicker oven than my own." "How fast Duchess is eating," thought Ribby to herself, as she buttered her 5th muffin. The pie dish was emptying rapidly. Duchess had had 4 helps already, and was fumbling with the spoon. "A little more bacon, my dear Duchess?" asked Ribby. "Thank you, my dear Ribby. I was only feeling for the patty pan." "The patty pan, my dear Duchess?" "The patty pan that held up the pie crust," said Duchess, blushing under her black coat. "Oh, I didn't put one in, my dear Duchess," said Ribby. "I don't think that is necessary in pies made of mouse." Duchess fumbled with the spoon. "I can't find it," she said anxiously. "There isn't a patty pan," said Ribby, looking perplexed. "Yes, indeed, my dear Ribby. Where can it have gone to?" said Duchess. "There most certainly is not one, my dear Duchess. I disapprove of tin articles in puddings and pies. It is most undesirable, especially when people swallow in lumps," she added in a lower voice. Duchess looked very much alarmed, and continued to scoop the inside of the pie dish. "My great aunt Squintina, grandmother of cousin Tabitha Twitchit, died of a thimble in a Christmas plum pudding. I never put any article of metal in my puddings or pies." Duchess looked aghast and tilted up the pie dish. "I have only 4 patty pans, and they are all in the cupboard." Duchess set up a howl. "I shall die! I shall die! I have swallowed a patty pan. Oh, my dear Ribby, I do feel so ill." "It is impossible, my dear Duchess. There was not a patty pan." Duchess moaned and whined and rocked herself about. "Oh, I feel so dreadful! I have swallowed a patty pan." "There was nothing in the pie," said Ribby severely. "Yes, there was, my dear Ribby. I am sure I have swallowed it." "Let me prop you up with a pillow, my dear Duchess. Where do you think you feel it?" "Oh, I do feel so ill all over me, my dear Ribby. I have swallowed a large tin patty pan with a sharp scalloped edge." "Shall I run for the doctor? I will just lock up the spoons." "Oh, yes, yes. Fetch Dr. Maggotty, my dear Ribby. He is a pie himself. He will certainly understand." Ribby settled Duchess in an armchair before the fire, and went out and hurried to the village to look for the doctor. She found him at the smithy. He was occupied in putting rusty nails into a bottle of ink, which he had obtained at the post office. "Gammon? Ha, ha!" said he. with his head on one side. Ribby explained that her guest had swallowed a patty pan. "Spinach? Ha, ha!" said he, and accompanied her with alacrity. He hopped so fast that Ribby had to run. It was most conspicuous. All the village could see that Ribby was fetching the doctor. "I knew they would overeat themselves," said Cousin Tabitha Twitchit. But while Ribby had been hunting for the doctor, a curious thing had happened to Duchess, who had been left by herself, sitting before the fire, sighing and groaning and feeling very unhappy. "How could I have swallowed it? Such a large thing as a patty pan!" She got up and went to the table and felt inside the pie dish again with a spoon. "No, there is no patty pan, and I put one in, and nobody has eaten pie except me, so I must have swallowed it." She sat down again and stared mournfully at the grate. The fire crackled and danced, and something sizzled. Duchess started. She opened the door of the top oven. Out came a rich, steamy flavor of veal and ham, and there stood a fine brown pie, and through a hole in the top of the pie crust there was a glimpse of a little tiny tin patty pan. Duchess drew a long breath. "Then I must have been eating mouse. No wonder I feel ill. But perhaps I should feel worse if I had really swallowed a patty pan," Duchess reflected. "What a very awkward thing to have to explain to Ribby. I think I will put my pie in the backyard and say nothing about it. When I go home I will run round and take it away." She put it outside the back door and sat down again by the fire and shut her eyes. When Ribby arrived with the doctor, she seemed fast asleep. "Gammon, ha, ha!" said the doctor. "I am feeling very much better," said Duchess, waking up with a jump. "I am truly glad to hear it. He has brought you a pill, my dear Duchess." "I think I should feel quite well if he only felt my pulse," said Duchess, backing away from the magpie, who sidled up with something in his beak. "It is only a bread pill. You had better take it. Drink a little milk, my dear Duchess." "Gammon, gammon," said the doctor, while Duchess coughed and choked. "Don't say that again," said Ribby, losing her temper. "Here, take this bread and jam, and get out into the yard." "Gammon and spinach, ha, ha, ha!" shouted Dr. Maggotty triumphantly outside the back door. "I am feeling very much better, my dear Ribby," said Duchess. "Do you not think that I had better go home before it gets dark?" "Perhaps it might be wise, my dear Duchess. I will lend you a nice warm shawl, and you shall take my arm." "I would not trouble you for worlds. I feel wonderfully better. One pill of Dr. Maggotty. Indeed, it is most admirable, if it has cured you of a patty pan. I will call directly after breakfast to ask how you have slept." Ribby and Duchess said good-bye affectionately, and Duchess started home. Halfway up the lane she stopped and looked back. Ribby had gone in and shut her door. Duchess slipped through the fence and ran round to the back of Ribby's house and peeped into the yard. Upon the roof of the pigsty sat Dr. Maggotty and 3 jackdaws. The jackdaws were eating pie crust, and the magpie was drinking gravy out of a patty pan. "Gammon, ha, ha!" he shouted, when he saw Duchess's little black nose peeping round the corner. Duchess ran home feeling uncommonly silly. When Ribby came out for a pailful of water to wash up the tea things, she found a pink and white pie dish lying smashed in the middle of the yard. The patty pan was under the pump, where Dr. Maggotty had considerately left it. Ribby stared with amazement. Did you ever see the like? So there really was a patty pan. But my patty pans are all in the kitchen cupboard. Well, I never did. Next time I want to give a party, I will invite Cousin Tabitha Twitchit. End of the Tale of the Pie and the Patty Pan by Beatrix Potter.
The Serpent with 8 Heads by Basil Hall Chamberlain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please contact LibriVox.org. Read by Algy Pug. The Serpent with 8 Heads. Did you ever hear the story of the 8-headed serpent? If not, I will tell it to you. It is rather a long one, and we must go a good way back to get to the beginning of it. In fact, we must go back to the beginning of the world. After the world had been created, it became the property of a very powerful fairy, and when this fairy was about to die, he divided it between his 2 boys and his girl. The girl, called Amma, was given the sun. The eldest boy, called Susano, was given the sea, and the second boy, whose name I forget, was given the moon. Well, the moon boy behaved himself properly, and you can still see his jolly round face on a clear night when the moon is full. But Susano was very angry and disappointed at having nothing but the cold, wet sea to live in. So up he rushed into the sky, burst into the beautiful room inside the sun, where his sister was sitting with her maidens, weaving gold and silver dresses, broke their spindles, trampled upon their work, and in short, did all the mischief he could, and frightened the poor maids to death. As for Amma, she ran away as fast as she could, and hid herself in a cave on the side of a mountain full of rocks and crags. When she had got into the cave and had shut the door, the whole world became pitch dark. For she was the fairy who ruled the sun, and could make it shine or not as she chose. In fact, some people say that the light of the sun is really nothing else than the brightness of her own bright eyes. Anyhow, there was great trouble over her disappearance. What was to be done to make the world light again? All sorts of plans were tried. At last, knowing that she was curious, and always liked to see everything that was going on, the other fairies got up a dance outside the door of the cave. When Amma heard the noise of the dancing and singing and laughing, she could not help opening the door a tiny bit, in order to peep through the chink at the fun the other fairies were having. This was just what they had been waiting for. "Look here," cried they, "look at this new fairy more beautiful than yourself," and therewith they thrust forward a mirror. Amma did not know that the face in the mirror was only the reflection of her own, and more curious to know who the new fairy could be, she ventured outside the door, where she was caught hold of by the other fairies, who piled up the entrance of the cave with big rocks, so that no one could ever go into it again. Seeing that she had been tricked into coming out of the cave, and that there was no use in sulking any longer, Amma agreed to go back to the sun and shine upon the world as before, provided her brother were punished and sent away in disgrace, for really he was not safe to live with. This was done. Susa was beaten to within an inch of his life, and expelled from the society of the other fairies, with orders never to show himself again. So poor Susa, having been turned out of fairyland, was obliged to come down to the earth. While walking one day on the bank of a river, he happened to see an old man and an old woman with their arms round their young daughter, and crying bitterly. "What is the matter?" asked Susa. "Oh," said they, their voices choked with sobs, "we used to have 8 daughters, but in a marsh near our hut there lives a huge 8-headed serpent who comes out once every year and eats up one of them. we have now only one daughter left, and to-day is the day when the serpent will come to eat her, and then we shall have none. Please, good sir, can you not do something to help us?" "Of course," answered Susa. "It will be quite easy. Do not be sad any longer. I am a fairy, and I will save your daughter." So he told them to brew some beer, and showed them how to make a fence with 8 gates in it, and a wooden stand inside each gate, and a large vat of beer on each stand. This they did, and just as all had been arranged in the way Susa had bidden them, the Serpent came. So huge was he that his body trained over 8 hills and 8 valleys as he wriggled along. But as he had 8 heads, he also had 8 noses, which made him able to smell 8 times as quickly as any other creature. So, smelling the beer from afar off, he at once glided towards it, went inside the fence, dipped one of his heads into each of the 8 vats, and drank, and drank, and drank, till he got quite tipsy. Then all his heads dropped down fast asleep. And Susa, jumping up from the hole where he had lain hidden, drew his sword, and cut them all off. He cut the body to pieces too. But, strange to say, when cutting the tail, the blade of his sword snapped. It had struck against something hard. As the serpent was now dead, there was no danger in going up to it, and finding out what the hard thing was. It turned out to be itself a sword, all set with precious stones, the most beautiful sword you ever saw. Susa took the sword and married the beautiful young girl, and he was very kind to her, although he had been so rude to his elder sister. They spent the rest of their lives in a beautiful palace, which was built on purpose for them, and the old father and mother lived there too. When the old father and mother, and Susa and his wife had all died, the sword was handed down to their children and grandchildren, and it now belongs to the Emperor of Japan, who looks upon it as one of his most precious treasures. End of The Serpent with 8 Heads by Basil Hall Chamberlain.
The Tale of Benjamin Bunny by Beatrix Potter. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. One morning a little rabbit sat on a bank. He pricked his ears and listened to the trit-trot of a pony. A gig was coming along the road. It was driven by Mr. McGregor, and beside him sat Mrs. McGregor in her best bonnet. As soon as they had passed, little Benjamin slid down into the road and set off with a hop, skip, and a jump to call upon his relations, who lived in the wood at the back of Mr. McGregor's garden. That wood was full of rabbit holes, and in the neatest, sandiest hole of all lived Benjamin's aunt and his cousins, Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. Old Mrs. Rabbit was a widow. She earned her living by knitting rabbit wool mittens and maffatis. I once bought a pair to bazaar. She also sold herbs and rosemary tea, and rabbit tobacco, which is what we call lavender. Little Benjamin did not very much want to see his aunt. He came round the back of the fir tree and nearly tumbled upon the top of his cousin Peter. Peter was sitting by himself. He looked poorly and was dressed in a red cotton pocket handkerchief. "Peter," said little Benjamin in a whisper, "who has got to your clothes?" Peter replied, "The scarecrow in Mr. McGregor's garden," and described how he had been chased about the garden and had dropped his shoes and coat. Little Benjamin sat down beside his cousin and assured him that Mr. McGregor had gone out in a gig, and Mrs. McGregor also, and certainly for the day because she was wearing her best bonnet. Peter said he hoped that it would rain. At this point old Mrs. Rabbit's voice was heard calling inside the rabbit hole, "Cottontail, Cottontail, fetch some more chamomile." Peter said he thought he might feel better if he went for a walk. They went away, hand in hand, and got upon the flat top of the wall at the bottom of the wood. From here they looked down into Mr. McGregor's garden. Peter's coat and shoes were plainly to be seen upon the scarecrow, topped with an old tam-o'-shanter of Mr. McGregor's. Little Benjamin said, "It spoils people's clothes to squeeze under a gate. The proper way to get in is to climb down a pear tree." Peter fell down head first, but it was of no consequence, as the bed below was newly raked and quite soft. It had been sown with lettuces. They left a great many odd little footmarks all over the bed, especially little Benjamin, who was wearing clogs. Little Benjamin said that the first thing to be done was to get back Peter's clothes, in order that they might be able to use the pocket handkerchief. They took them off the Scarecrow. There had been rain during the night. There was water in the shoes, and the coat was somehow shut. Benjamin tried the tam-o'-shanter, but it was too big for him. Then he suggested that he should fill the pocket-handkerchief with onions, as a little present for his aunt. Peter did not seem to be enjoying himself. He kept hearing noises. Benjamin, on the contrary, was perfectly at home, and ate a lettuce leaf. He said that he was in the habit of coming to the garden with his father to get lettuces for their Sunday dinner. The name of little Benjamin's papa was old Mr. Benjamin Bunny. The lettuces were certainly very fine. Peter did not eat anything. He said he should like to go home. Presently he dropped half the onions. Little Benjamin said that it was not possible to get back up the pear tree with a load of vegetables. He led the way boldly towards the other end of the garden. They went along a little walk on planks under a sunny red brick wall. The mice sat on the doorsteps, cracking cherry stones. They winked at Peter Rabbit and little Benjamin Bunny. Presently, Peter let the pocket-handkerchief go again. They got amongst flower pots and frames and tubs. Peter heard noises worse than ever. His eyes were as big as lollipops. He was a step or two in front of his cousin when he suddenly stopped. This is what those little rabbits saw around the corner. Little Benjamin took one look, and then, in a half a minute less than no time, he hid himself and Peter and the onions underneath a large basket. The cat got up and stretched herself, and came and sniffed at the basket. Perhaps she liked the smell of onions. Anyway, she sat down upon the top of the basket. She sat there for 5 hours. I could not draw you a picture of Peter and Benjamin underneath the basket, because it was quite dark, and because the smell of onions was fearful. It made Peter Rabbit and little Benjamin cry. The sun got round behind the wall, and it was quite late in the afternoon, but still the cat sat upon the basket. At length there was a pitter-patter, and some bits of mortar fell from the wall above. The cat looked up and saw old Mr. Benjamin Bunny prancing along the top of the wall of the upper terrace. He was smoking a pipe of rabbit tobacco, and had a little switch in his hand. He was looking for his son. Old Mr. Bunny had no opinion whatever of cats. He took a tremendous jump off the top of the wall, onto the top of the cat, and cuffed it off the basket, and kicked it into the greenhouse, scratching off a handful of fur. The cat was much too surprised to scratch back. When old Mr. Bunny had driven the cat into the greenhouse, he locked the door. Then he came back to the basket and took out his son Benjamin by the ears and whipped him with the little switch. Then he took out his nephew Peter. Then he took out the handkerchief of onions and marched out of the garden. When Mr. McGregor returned about half an hour later, he observed several things which perplexed him. It looked as though some person had been walking all over the garden in a pair of clogs, only the footmarks were too ridiculously little. Also, he could not understand how the cat could have managed to shut herself up inside the greenhouse, locking the door upon the outside. When Peter got home, his mother forgave him, because she was so glad to see that he had found his shoes and coat. Cottontail and Peter folded up the pocket-handkerchief, and old Mrs. Rabbit strung up the onions and hung them from the kitchen ceiling, with bunches of herbs and the rabbit tobacco. End of The Tale of Benjamin Bunny by Beatrix Potter. Read by Halle.